The committee will come to order. Following Hamas's horrific October 7th terrorist attack on Israel, anti-Semitism raged across the world, including on America's college campuses. This committee moved swiftly to investigate this spike in hate by holding a hearing just a few weeks after the attack. Over the last 8 months, Americans have seen how the inaction of university leaders embolden anti-Israel, anti-Jew, and anti-American radicals on college campuses. That inaction resulted in encampments springing up at many of America's so-called elite universities and brought education at those institutions to a grinding halt. Students, faculty, and outside agitators stormed campus buildings and blocked entrances. Classes were disrupted or moved online. Long-awaited graduation ceremonies were canceled. Following this committee's hearing in November, we launched an investigation into several universities regarding their handling of violence and harassment of Jewish students on their campuses. The universities under investigation all failed to root out anti-Semitism and protect Jewish students on their campuses. The committee continues to receive evidence and first-hand accounts that schools are ignoring the concerns of Jewish students, failing to enforce campus policies, and refusing to discipline students found to have violated university rules and codes of conduct. Just a few examples of such failures include the failure of MIT to discipline students who violated campus policies simply because they were not Americans and were here on student visas. The failure of Harvard to listen to the recommendations of its anti-Semitism advisory group, even though the committee identified ways Jewish students were being harassed. The failure of Cornell to enforce real discipline on campus agitators who violated campus policies by repeatedly disrupting basic educational functions, including class and exams. The failure of Penn to take meaningful disciplinary action against students and faculty who violated campus policies, including one student who stole an Israeli flag from a campus apartment and the Faculty for Justice in Palestine blocking the entrance to campus. The committee's investigation has identified 3 key areas of concern. First is the fact that weak university leadership has repeatedly failed to protect students and focus on its actual mission of educating students. Second is the role that radical faculty are playing in fueling and in some cases taking part in violations of campus policy and law, on top of teaching concepts that fuel anti-Semitism and hatred. Lastly, there's the role that international students are playing in anti-Semitic and dangerous protest on college campuses across the country. Our investigation continues, but based on the evidence already gathered, we can easily see that many universities are failing their students by turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism. Instead, they are caving to the demands of loud, hateful, and destructive detractors, often to the detriment of student safety, coursework, class time, and academic success on campus. That is no way to fulfill an educational mission. I'm glad that Speaker Johnson called for a collective House investigation to bolster this committee's effort that started in November. House Republicans will continue to press universities to fulfill their tax-exempt purpose by changing course to regain control of campuses. To the universities listening, If you think we will lose focus, interest, or forget about this, you couldn't be more wrong. We will continue to use the tools of the Ways and Means Committee to protect Americans on college campuses from danger until university administrators grow a spine and start doing their job. I want to thank each of our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to learning more about what is occurring on college campuses today and how the situation has evolved since the hearing in November. I'm pleased to recognize Ranking Member Neal for his opening statement.
Thank you. I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning, and especially a warm welcome to our former colleague and my friend, former Congressman Ted Deutsch. And congratulations to Talia for her graduation as well. At the outset, I think it's fair to say that we all condemn anti-Semitism. Since our last hearing, we are saddened that the hateful actions and rhetoric that has too often targeted Jewish students has continued. These incidents have disrupted campuses, leaving too many questioning safety. Universities certainly have a responsibility to cultivate safe and supportive learning environments. And today, we're going to hear what has happened in the spring and consider recommendations to combat anti-Semitism on campuses this fall. Some of today's witnesses may blame campus anti-Semitism on DEI programs. I do not agree. Celebrating and learning from our differences is how we become a more inclusive nation while combating some of the biggest threats. The idea here should remain part of the universal form called unity without uniformity. The Biden administration has been hard at work to help our campuses, announcing multiple actions to address reported anti-Semitic incidents at our schools and our college campuses, including the role of DHS and DOJ as they engage with state, local, and campus law enforcement. The administration has also updated the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights Discrimination Complaints to process and specify that there are certain forms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that are prohibited under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Our universities, I anticipate, will take the summer to prepare for what comes next. Americans are counting on the continuation of free thought and at the same time the safety of students on our college campuses. We need to meet the moment with great care, thoughtfulness, and vigilance. Fighting anti-Semitism and indeed all hate should remain our priority. Not to miss the point that there was ugly strains of religious bigotry throughout American history, including the role that the Know-Nothings played in opposition to immigration more than a century ago. Denouncing bigotry in all forms is an American value, and that's one that we must carry forward from here today. Let me yield the balance of my time to a gentleman who's exhibited, I think, great sound temperament and advice to the committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal, and welcome. I'll take the privilege to also welcome my dear friend, former colleague Ted Deutsch, and make note of the piece of tape on your lapel that says 251 days since the hostages were captured. And to Talia, I extend congratulations to you and your family on graduation. Graduation from Columbia, which has been at the center of much of what we are talking about today. And it's not surprising. It's not something that happened overnight at Columbia. It's an issue that has festered there for a very long time, but was accelerated following October 7th. And we'll talk more about that today. What should every young person be able to rightly expect when attending college or university, often leaving the safety of their home communities for the first time? To be educated, to learn the lessons and skills to prepare for a successful, fulfilling career in life. To be intellectually challenged, including having some of their core beliefs, their most closely held truths, proven wrong. But also to be safe in their person, in their spirit, in their ability to learn and grow, to step out of their comfort zones and expand their horizons. What we have seen on campuses across the country since October 7th is an explosion of anti-Semitism, often in its most vile forms, specifically targeting Jewish students under the guise of anti-Israel or anti-Zionist protest. According to the ADL, we saw a nearly 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in just the first few months after October 7th. And the rate only accelerated in the spring as the weather improved and the protesters moved to occupy campuses. To be clear, being anti-Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic, any more than being opposed to the policies of any other country or government. However, delegitimizing Jews' aspiration for a state in their national homeland, a land in which Jews have continuously lived for 3,500 years, is absolutely anti-Semitism. Excluding Jewish, Israeli, and pro-Israeli students from classrooms, public spaces, and organizational activities on campus is anti-Semitism. Vandalizing the homes, offices, or rooms of Jewish administrators, faculties, or students is anti-Semitism. Our colleges and universities should be safe places for learning and growth, not hotbeds of hate and discrimination. Too many Jewish students on campus have been targeted as individuals and collectively. This is not about free speech. I will defend everyone's right to stand at the Rock at Northwestern or Harvard Yard or the Quad or the center of any school and express their views. But when speech crosses over into hate, to intimidation, to exclusion or isolation, it is imperative that school leaders, including university presidents, but also faculty and even student governments and student leaders, recognize that hate has no place on their campus. Every student, irrespective of religion, nationality, or ideology, must feel safe, and we expect our universities to ensure that they do. I yield back.
Thank you. Before I begin, I want to take a moment and acknowledge Dr. Murphy and also Mr. Evans, both valued members of our committee that are not with us because they're both recovering from treatments and procedures. And we'll continue to keep them in our prayers, and we look forward to both of them coming back to our committee very soon. I will now introduce our witnesses. One of the witnesses from our November hearing, Ms. Talia Dror, is back today to update us on how the environment on her college campus, Cornell University, has worsened. To her credit, despite the sad circumstances on campus, she graduated college a few weeks ago. And on behalf of the entire committee, I'd like to extend our congratulations and welcome you back. We have Professor Shadavidai. Shadavidai. Is that, well, it's closer.
Like the adjective.
I'm gonna call you Professor. Professor. He's an assistant professor of business at Columbia Business School. We have Dr. Jonathan Pidluzny, is director of higher education reform at America First Policy Institute. We have the Honorable Kenneth L. Marcus, is founder and chairman at Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights under Law. And we have the Honorable and former colleague, Mr. Ted Deutsch. Welcome back to the House. He's the Chief Executive Officer at American Jewish Community. Thank you all for joining us today. Your written statements will be made part of the hearing record, and you each have 5 minutes to deliver your remarks. Mr. R., you may begin when you are ready.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the Ways and Means Committee. Thank you for inviting me back to testify today. My name is Talia Dror. I'm a recent graduate of Cornell University. 7 months ago, I described how directly after the October 7th attacks, my campus erupted in celebration. I explained how the anti-Semitic environment fostered by pro-Hamas students, professors, and administrators led to a Cornell student threatening to bomb our kosher dining hall and slaughter every Jew on our campus. I am here today to tell you that since then, blatant violations of Cornell's code of conduct continue, appeased and rewarded by my university. Now, these violations have been exposed for what they truly are, expressions not just of Jew hatred, but of a burning hatred for the United States itself. In December, students occupied our main building, vandalizing it with genocidal slogans and hoisting a Palestinian flag on an American flagpole. In January, student protesters chanted, "Houthis, Houthis, make us proud, turn another ship around." The Houthis are a US-designated terrorist organization whose slogan reads, quote, "God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory to Islam." Throughout the month of February, protesters held weekly die-ins. I was in the library during the first die-in. I watched as hundreds of masked students lay on the floor and began chanting anti-Semitic slogans. As I watched alongside visibly disturbed students, I saw an administrator just standing there and watching, doing nothing to enforce Cornell's policies. A Jewish freshman who was studying there recognized me and began sobbing in my arms. As I held this girl, whose name I did not even know, I realized the gravity of the moment. Cornell's administration has made a decision to protect hateful radicals at the expense of everyone else. In the following weeks, Cornell's policy of appeasement resulted in classes constantly being canceled and exams needing to be moved as the pro-Hamas group wreaked havoc. Anti-American students stifle intellectual disagreement by threatening anyone who does not conform to their orthodoxy. On March 3rd, a Jewish student was accosted by a fellow student who approached her and yelled, "Effing Zionist scum. Yeah, I've seen you around, genocidaire. God forbid a Zionist feel unsafe." The university's investigation has been open for over 3 months now with no resolution in sight. On March 29th, a member of Cornell's student government refused to allow pro-Hamas students to break election rules. That night, a student told him that he better watch his back and that he would regret ever joining the student assembly. This should come as no surprise, as the administration not only allows these incidents to occur, it promotes the anti-Semitic ideology fueling them. As part of their education series on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, the university sponsored a lecture by Sahar Aziz, who's currently being investigated by both the US House and Senate for espousing vile anti-Semitic propaganda. Cornell has also platformed a vocal pro-Hamas student who referred to Jewish students as, quote, bloodthirsty Zionists only satiated by the blood of Palestinians, and claims that he does not take his cue from the Cornell Student Assembly, but rather from the armed resistance in Palestine, referring to Hamas. Next year, this student will be teaching an introductory course for incoming freshmen. On April 25th, Cornell students formed an encampment, blatantly violating the code of conduct. Encampers chanted phrases like "there is only one solution, Intifada revolution," a call to kill Jews worldwide. 3 weeks later, when the encampment was dismantled, the university issued a statement expressing gratitude that the students terrorizing campus somehow restrained themselves from physically carrying out their violent sentiments. All the administration had to do was enforce its existing rules. Instead, it chose to negotiate with the protesters, grant them immunity, and thank them for their self-restraint. The message was very clear. Rules are meaningless and lawlessness is rewarded. Let me be very clear. The hostile environment I have just described to you pervades campuses all across the country, from Harvard to UC Santa Barbara, from UCLA to Yale. American universities have allowed themselves to be controlled by vicious chants, rule breaking, and anarchy. If they wish to continue benefiting from government funding, they must start upholding American values rather than bowing to those who wish to see this country burn. My tuition has subsidized the indoctrination of a generation that hates our country. It would be a disgrace for even one more taxpayer dollar to do the same. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Professor Davidai, you are now recognized.
My name is Shai Davidai. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia Business School. Since October 7th, when Hamas raped, tortured, slaughtered, and kidnapped more than 1,400 of my people, Columbia's campus has been a hostile environment for Jews and Israelis like me. Over the past months, Jewish students have locked themselves in dorms to avoid being assaulted. They have been spat on, attacked, bullied, vilified, chased, and told to keep effing running. This is not an exaggeration. This is the reality of what it's like being Jewish and Israeli at Columbia since October 7th. For more than 8 months, Columbia University has refused to deal with the student organizations whose leaders and members have, among other things, publicly supported Hamas, the PFLP, and the Islamic Jihad, illegally occupied public spaces on campus from which they denied entry to Jewish and Israeli students, violently took over a university building and held an employee hostage against his will, chanted in support of the Houthis, a terrorist organization whose flag calls for death to Israel, death to America, and a curse upon the Jews, called for the extermination of Israel, called for Zionists to be killed, called for rockets to be shot at Tel Aviv, supported the Islamic Republic of Iran in its attack on Israeli civilian targets, harassed a rabbi who was escorting Jewish students to safety, hosted the wife of a man convicted of providing material support to Hamas, amplified calls by Hamas for violence in Jerusalem, set up memorials for convicted terrorists on campus, called on the military wing of Hamas to attack Jewish American students, and invited speakers with known ties to terrorist organizations to an event in support of terrorism. Everything I've just noted is well documented and known to the university leaders. Yet there are two Columbias, a Columbia in theory and a Columbia in practice. In theory, Columbia suspended two organizations and a handful of their leaders for their pro-terror activity. In practice, these suspensions were never enforced and they continue to organize on campus without interruptions. In theory, Columbia has stated that pro-terror campus protests are unauthorized. In practice, the university has never dispersed even a single protest. In theory, Columbia cares about the safety of its Jewish and Israeli students. In practice, it doesn't. Minu Shafiq, Jerry Rosberg, Cass Holloway, and Felice Rozan have all personally allowed these organizations to terrorize Jewish and Israeli students with complete impunity. They must be held accountable. Yet these individuals are just the tip of the iceberg. We must hold accountable the entire administration and the Board of Trustees. We must hold accountable the faculty who openly support and celebrate terrorism. Professor Joseph Massad, who expressed his jubilation and awe at the massacre, rape, torture, and kidnapping of Israeli civilians. Professor Mohammed Abdu, who openly supports terrorism, stating that he is with the resistance, be it Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Jihad. Professor Catherine Frank, who has justified terrorist attacks against Israel and has claimed that Israelis are a danger on campus. Professor Rashid Khalidi, who was reportedly the spokesperson for the PLO when it was still an active terrorist organization and who has legitimized Hamas and Islamic Jihad as resistance fighters. Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who has called for the dismantling of the Jewish state, and Professors Asim Ansari and Kamal Jadidi of Columbia Business School, who, along with many other professors, signed a letter minimizing the massacre, rape, and kidnapping of civilians as merely a military response. These professors receive millions of dollars in federal funding for their research and teaching. These professors teach the next generation of American doctors, lawyers, teachers, leaders, and social workers. These are the professors with whom American parents entrust their kids' safety. This is why I'm here. I'm here to speak up for every decent American who believes that anti-Semitism and support for terrorism have no place on campus. I am here to speak up for every person, Jewish or non-Jewish, who believes that rape is never, never, never okay. I am here to speak up for the future of higher education. Yes, I paid a personal price for speaking up, but I would rather pay the price for speaking up than the price for staying silent. Let me be clear, this is not about politics. The terrorists who kidnapped Keith Siegel, an American from North Carolina, did not stop to ask him who he voted for in the previous elections. The professors who called the kidnapping of Omer Nutra, an American from Long Island, a military response, do not care about his geopolitics. The students who desecrate pictures of Hersh Goldberg Polin, an American who had his arm blown off before being kidnapped into Gaza, do not care about his views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not about politics. This is about hate. Hate for Israel, hate for the Jewish people's right for self-determination, and hate for America and all that it stands for. Like the US Congress, I and many others have been asleep at the wheel for too long. It is time to take action. It is time to wake up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Pidluzny, you are now recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It's a real privilege. I direct the Higher Education Reform Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. Prior to joining AFPI, I was Vice President of Academic Affairs at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. I began my career on a public university campus and spent 10 great years teaching political science in Kentucky. What's happened on US campuses since the Hamas massacre should shake us to the core. It's not just that the hatred is deep in the places where we train tomorrow's leaders. University administrators have reacted to violent displays of anti-Semitism with indifference to their Jewish students' well-being. Perhaps most surprising of all, the worst of the violence and harassment has occurred at the country's wealthiest and its most prestigious institutions. This matters for many reasons, not least because our elite universities shape the broader public culture. What happens on campus today will radiate through American society, reshaping attitudes for years to come. With my time today, I'd like to explore some of the reasons I think the hatred is most pronounced at elite universities. There are three main drivers of campus anti-Semitism in my view: anti-Zionist faculty, radical students and the pro-Hamas student groups they lead, and the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that now suffuse higher education. I'd like to focus on DEI because it's the atmospheric cause, the ideas in the air that dispose young people to find anti-Semitic faculty and students so compelling. DEI is not about ensuring that underprepared students have the support they need to succeed in educational programs that promise a high return on investment. Universities should actually be doing more of that. DEI's real priorities are drawn from critical race theory. The goal is to use the university to re-engineer American society away from its aspirational ideals, equality before the law, equal treatment according to individual merit. Instead, DEI pushes relentlessly for equity, equal outcomes, and to dismantle, quote, systemic oppression by making race and identity central to everything we do and everything we think. As such, DEI teaches that the world is made up of oppressors and the oppressed, victims and those with privilege. This divisive ideology primes students to make snap judgments about each other based on skin color and identity group stereotypes. Jews are coded as the oppressors by virtue of their political and economic success. This is what creates a kind of permission structure for students to join in with the true radicals cheering for the Hamas terrorists who deliberately kill children and rape hostages. Major universities spend tens of millions of dollars each year on DEI, and their armies number in the hundreds. This helps to explain why anti-Semitism is more pronounced on elite campuses. They have been funding what drives it for over a decade. 4 points in closing will give perspective on how this relates to higher education finance. First, of the 12 wealthiest private universities by endowment value, 11 had anti-Semitic encampments or arrests. In 2022, Harvard's endowment hit $53 billion. Columbia's topped 14. The 300 private schools with endowments valued at more than $100,000 per student together control well over $500 billion, war chests that receive supremely favorable tax treatment. Second, elite universities receive billions in federal grants and contracts every year. To be sure, these programs fund important research, but universities also receive indirect cost reimbursements as high as 69% on top of the programs funded. That's unrestricted revenue that can be spent on other priorities. In 2022, Columbia took in $1.2 billion in federal grants and contracts, and again, all but one of the top 12 private university recipients of federal grants saw anti-Semitic arrests or encampments this spring. Third, foreign money has been flowing to elite universities for decades. In recent years, the sums have been enormous. For example, $1.8 billion since 2014 for Cornell, and that's just from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Last, elite universities enroll thousands of foreign students who generally pay full freight. It only takes a small number to spark violent and menacing protests. Our analysis revealed that out of the 111 universities with anti-Semitic encampments and/or arrests this year, 20 have student bodies consisting of more than 20% foreign students. 13 campuses surpass 25%. In conclusion, the spasms of hate that have convulsed elite universities demonstrate that existing accountability structures are insufficient. Immense public investment in higher education rightly makes this an important subject for congressional oversight. It also gives the Congress several powerful policy levers to effect positive change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marcus.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, distinguished members of the committee, Thank you for inviting me to join you. I'm Kenneth L. Marcus, chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law and former Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights. Over the last 20 years, I have been fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses, but never seen anything like what we have experienced since October 7. Even in the year prior to October 7, we saw record levels of anti-Semitism on college campuses. In the 3 weeks following October 7, we saw as many incidents reported to us as in the prior record-breaking year. Over the time since then, and in particular since this committee had its last hearing, what we have seen is a spreading of the extreme and violent situation on a handful of campuses throughout this country. While there are elite institutions such as Harvard and Berkeley that have been in the news, the fact is that we are seeing problems even at institutions that had previously seen none of them. We are seeing a kind of perfect storm of student violent extremism, professorial politicization, undisclosed foreign funding, and often feckless and weak administration. This is happening all over the country to the extent that I would say it is a crisis that needs to be dealt with. Most of these institutions are tax exempt and need to be held accountable if they do not meet the requirements of their tax exempt status. That's true of the universities and also of some of the organizations that have been fomenting hatred. My former agency, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, has a central role in addressing this campus anti-Semitism. During this administration, they have done some things right. The national strategy from the White House raised awareness of the issue. There has been transparency and also, I would say, a number of cases opened, some of them in a timely manner. At the same time, we've seen no significant policy advances. We've seen extremely slow enforcement of campus anti-Semitism cases. We've seen tools available to the agency that are not being used, such as the possibility of proactive compliance reviews, proactive agency-directed investigations, the possibility of joint investigations by OCR and the Department of Justice, which has been used in prior administrations and could be used here. Lots of different tools that are available that aren't being used, and we'd like to see that changed. Beyond that, we have seen good cases being dismissed in ways that appear to deviate from the law. For example, cases that are being dismissed under Rule 110H of the OCR manual, which allows dismissal in some class actions, but which has been used for dismissals in some non-class action cases. In other words, we are not seeing the sort of enforcement that we would like to see. In fairness, the Education Department doesn't have all of the tools that it could use. While it does have the ability to deny all federal funds to an institution, that is a remedy that is not necessarily sufficient because it is used so rarely, if ever at all. It would certainly be helpful if additional remedies were available to address recalcitrant institutions that permitted hostile environments. This House of Representatives did good work when it passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. The fact is that one of the greatest problems for universities and also for the federal government is an inability to determine when incidents can be considered anti-Semitism and when they aren't. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, if enacted into law, would be a big step. But there are other problems that are still unaddressed. One of the most disturbing problems that we have seen is that when Jewish students try to report anti-Semitism through university grievance programs, they often face retaliation. They are often accused of other sorts of incidents, and those accusations are taken seriously. Retaliatory claims and counterclaims have to be addressed as well. Beyond that, we need to look at joint compliance, national initiatives, and investigation into those groups that have at least the appearance of potentially advancing terrorism. Any university that has a student organization that has indicated a potential support for terrorism should be investigating it, and to the extent that isn't happening, it should be done by the United States federal government. Given the importance of tax-exempt status for institutions that receive it, I think that it is entirely welcome that this committee is looking into this issue and that there is room for strengthening the protections that we have for our students. I thank this committee for its attention and thank you for including me in this hearing.
Thank you. Congressman Deutsch, you're recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, members of the committee, it's a Honored to be before you to testify in this body where I served alongside many of you for 7 terms. Today I'm here in my capacity as CEO of American Jewish Committee on the heels of our global forum where 2,000 Jewish leaders, including hundreds of young leaders from around the world, convened. And what's happening on university campuses in the United States is the threat that everyone from all of the 55 countries represented expects us to confront, because our Jewish students and faculty are on the front lines of the battle against dangerous anti-Semitism. Protests in the weeks after 10/7 featured students and faculty celebrating terror, unapologetically declaring Hamas's barbarity to be exhilarating and glorious and liberating. Over winter break, the Jewish community held its collective breath, hoping the temperature would be turned down on college campuses. Instead, we witnessed a doubling down in the spring, as Talia and Shai both spoke powerfully too. Radical anti-Israel protesters commandeered campus quads, occupied university buildings, fomenting vile anti-Semitic messaging, and creating an atmosphere of harassment, intimidation, and fear for Jewish students, faculty, and staff, and disrupting normal campus activities for all campus citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. Students have been forced to walk a gauntlet on college campuses, finding alternative pathways to classes, dining halls, libraries, just to stay safe. They have watched as campus events featuring Israeli speakers were canceled or moved to secret, out-of-the-way hiding spots. And they've had classes moved online because it was no longer safe for them to be on campus. And the response of many university presidents and chancellors to these events has been woefully inadequate and completely lacking in leadership. Jewish life on campus became narrowed, relegated to dark corners, while lawless protesters took center stage and were allowed to remain there, despite pushing past every margin of acceptable conduct. In some cases, these radical individuals were granted a seat at the table with university boards as a reward for their blatant disregard of the rules. It should not come as a surprise that this school year shook to the core the Jewish community's trust in institutions of higher learning. University leaders must use these summer months to confront this problem that risk permanently staining the reputations of our country's top academic institutions. And they must disabuse themselves of the notion that everything will return to normal in the coming year. Accepting anti-Semitism as normal is what helped get us to this place. And the news from just the past few days confirms that the threats to the Jewish community are increasing, and we know that colleges are not immune. Last weekend, down the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue near the White House, protesters held signs, screamed and defaced statues with "Stand with Hamas," "Kill another Zionist now," calls for jihad, and "Death to America." On Monday in New York, a mob celebrated the Hamas murder of over 360 people at the Nova Music Festival. On Tuesday, a mass group boarded a New York subway car and shouted, "Raise your hands if you're a Zionist." Masked people on a subway asking, "Raise your hand if you're a Zionist. This is your chance to get out." And also this week, homes of Jewish employees and leadership of the Brooklyn Museum were vandalized with signs saying "white supremacist, Zionist." Every member of this committee should be sickened by this. Every member of this committee should say so publicly. This anti-Semitic and anti-American incitement to violence can no longer be tolerated. It must be stopped before it leads to real violence. Is it any wonder that AJC's most recent State of Anti-Semitism in America shows that 78% of American Jews feel less safe since the attacks of 10/7? In our work with administrators and included in our toolkit for university leadership, AJC emphasizes initiatives to address anti-Semitism head on so that it doesn't become permanent, which it will unless we assertively counter it with strong, coordinated, and multi-pronged approach. With this in mind, we recommend that schools update their codes of conduct and actually enforce their own rules, include anti-Semitism education and training for their entire communities, return to centers of fact-based exchange, ensure the physical safety of Jewish students, and university presidents should announce that they will open Title VI compliance offices, much like they have Title IX offices. The House has passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and I encourage you to support and pass the Countering Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would help strengthen federal efforts to counter anti-Semitism, including higher education. There are students in your districts being told that their identity as Jews and Zionists is putting their safety at risk. Listen to them. Use your important role as a member of the U.S. House to help them. In closing, please remember, anti-Semitism is not just a threat to the Jewish community. It's a threat to our democracy. This moment is not just about anti-Semitism, it's about the society that we want to live in. We must hold schools accountable. We must protect all students, and we must work together in a bipartisan fashion and declare zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. We have seen throughout the history of the Jewish people where anti-Semitism can lead. Now is the time. Act with the urgency this moment demands. Thank you for inviting me back to the House for this very important hearing.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll now move to questions. Mr. Orr, you testified before our committee during the past fall semester about your experience with violent threats and harassment and other anti-Semitic behavior on Cornell's campus. You recalled being terrified, knowing that as an outspoken Jewish leader, you could likely be identified and targeted by anyone seeking to do harm. Did you feel the same way during the spring semester that just completed?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thankfully, there were no more expressed death threats against Jewish students this semester, but watching the widespread acceptance and normalization of anti-Semitism kind of created a different type of fear in me. Watching myself and fellow Jewish students begin to develop an "it could be worse" mentality. We could be getting stabbed in the eye like my friend Sahar at Yale did, or be told that we deserve to go back to Poland like my friend Shai did. I began to realize how dangerous it is to become desensitized to this form of bigotry and hatred.
Professor Davidai, many of us here have heard about what happened on Columbia University's campus this spring. I'm happy that you are here with us today. So can we hear firsthand from a member of the faculty about what has been going on at Columbia, including the unauthorized encampment, which resulted in police arresting over 100 Columbia students? What do you think are the main factors that led students to feel emboldened to essentially take over Columbia's campus?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I would say that there are two main factors. One is a complete lack of leadership and accountability from the administration. The student organizations and their leaders have seen that they can do whatever they want with complete impunity, that when they break the laws, the university will send out a strong email but will not follow it. When they get suspended, nothing actually is enforced, that they can hold unauthorized protests and won't be dispersed, that they can basically spew out hate, anti-Semitism, and pro-terror rhetoric, and nothing will happen to them. And the second factor is the faculty. There have been many faculty who've not only indoctrinated these students and egged them on to keep going, like Professor Catherine Frank, but many faculty who actually defended with their bodies to stop police enforcement of the illegal encampment. So when you have a mixture of pro-Hamas, pro-Islamic Jihad faculty and an administration that shows no leadership and no accountability, that's what you get.
So I think it's safe to say, based on your answer there, that Columbia has not been living up to its obligations, to its students, and fulfilling its educational purpose.
I would say that it didn't even pretend to live up. It's not that Columbia can't, it's that Columbia won't.
Columbia won't. And the professors you listed in your opening statement, that's extremely disturbing. Thank you. Mr. Marcus, part of today's hearing is to see what, if anything, Congress can or should do to hold schools accountable and protect students on campus. For this committee, that includes considering whether colleges and universities are complying with Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code and fulfilling their tax-exempt purpose. For our committees, that may mean, for other committees, that also may mean looking at Title VI and the Department of Education's process for resolving these types of complaints. Based on your experience, do you think it would be helpful if federal agencies had additional tools to use when investigating colleges and universities for alleged violations of anti-discrimination laws? And are there any policy solutions Congress should consider?
Yes, Chairman Smith, thank you. I do think that additional remedies are necessary. There is the possibility of lawsuits, but those are expensive and lengthy. The current process at OCR is also somewhat cumbersome and seldom leads to the sort of resolution that really would require fundamental change, nor is the OCR system necessarily built for the sort of crisis that we have today. So for those institutions that are recalcitrant in the face of growing anti-Semitism to which they have shown something like deliberate indifference, I think a more streamlined, quicker process that could lead to issues with respect to tax-exempt status would be a welcome addition to the remedies that are now at play.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neal, for questions.
Thank you. Mr. Deutsch, give you a chance to answer the same questions that were just offered to Mr. Marcus, and give you an opportunity to discuss safety on campus, what suggestions you would make to take action against anti-Semitism beyond the universal condemnation that you've heard. And perhaps you could talk a bit about your recommendations for integrating anti-Semitism training in many of our institutions.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. First of all, in response to the question about what can Congress do, the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education needs additional resources. The challenges that we've all described are so great. We want and expect the Office of Civil Rights to take necessary action, to begin investigations promptly, and most importantly, to complete them promptly so that accountability can actually be brought to bear. They need additional resources so that they can do that. I mentioned as well the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. There are two ways to address anti-Semitism. One is to identify it, and Congress passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act because identifying anti-Semitism is important. That's what the IRA definition does. It's why AJC's worked to pass it so many places around the world and around the United States, and it's what that bill does, and I hope that the Senate will pass that as well. The Countering Anti-Semitism Act strengthens federal efforts beyond that. Once we've identified anti-Semitism, we should have greater resources. There should be someone in the White House going forward in every administration that's focused on this issue. Same at the Department of Education. That's what that bill, HR 7921, does, and I encourage members to look at it, to co-sponsor it, and ultimately, I hope the Speaker will bring it up so that it can pass. In terms of safety on campus, there are different steps that the universities can take, but first and foremost, and I think we all agree, and we've heard different versions of this, the campus administration has to enforce its own rules. The code of conduct on its campus has to be updated. Some of the student codes of conduct were written so long ago, they don't even acknowledge the existence of social media. They don't acknowledge the current world that we live in. They should be revised for the benefit of not just Jewish students, but for the community as a whole. And then they need to be enforced. There need to be repercussions when those rules are violated, and that stands in stark contrast to what we've seen on some campuses where the violation of those rules has actually been rewarded. That's an important step. And universities need, beyond that, they need to be very clear in ensuring, and this is, I'm sure, a conversation that will take place over the course of this day, there needs to be viewpoint diversity on campus. When you allow one group to completely silence another, the harassment and intimidation of Jewish students, of Israeli students, is meant to silence them. And universities have a role to play in ensuring that if they intend the university to live up to its ideals as a place where a free exchange of ideas can actually take place, then you have to actually hear all voices. And you can't allow one group to silence the voices that they disagree with, and in this case, that they violently disagree with. That's an important step that has to be taken, and there is a responsibility, I'll just finish, Ranking Member Neal, with the faculty as well. There are the challenges that exist with the faculty, the way that faculty on some campuses conduct themselves in ways even in violation of the guidelines on academic freedom that the American Academy of University Professors sets out, winds up doing damage again to the ultimate goals of the university, which is to be a place where there can be a free exchange of ideas. That has to be tackled seriously, and this has to be done over not just the coming semester, but this is something that universities need to focus on over the coming years, and it starts with university presidents who set the right tone, who speak with moral clarity, who understand that what's happening at this moment when there are protesters supporting terrorist groups runs contrary to everything about that university campus.
Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you to our witnesses here today as well. This committee's jurisdiction is built around the tax code, obviously, and it's important we conduct oversight to ensure entities receiving tax exemptions or credits through the code are following applicable rules. That concept is not unique to educational institutions. For example, I don't really agree with much of the Democrats' stimulus bill from 2022, but they understood what they were doing when they wrote domestic content requiremments into their electric vehicle tax credit. We have historically limited who credit unions can serve and how much they can lend to businesses because they are exempt from tax while banks are not. Even popular individual provisions like individual retirement accounts and 529s have rules about what you can and can't do with the funds in exchange for receiving tax deferral or exemption. Colleges and universities shouldn't be treated any differently. They receive their tax-exempt status on the basis of providing quality education in a safe environment. When they fail to do that, we should all be concerned. I'm chilled by what I hear, not just on the news, but comments here today. Professor Davidai, you've spoken publicly about the radical viewpoints taught by specific professors, I believe, at Columbia. For example, it's my understanding one colleague of yours, known for anti-Israel positions, recently published a controversial article which described the Hamas attacks as, quote, awesome, end quote, and as a, quote, resistance offensive, end quote. I think you've pointed to some of these. But another Columbia professor published a social media post stating, I'm with Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, end quote. I know that this is not limited to just Columbia. That's certainly my observation. But it's bad enough when students might intimidate other students and the administration would take a dismissive posture. When faculty engages in rhetoric such as this, I am extremely concerned. I find it chilling, absolutely chilling, that this situation is what it is. Professor Davidai, from your perspective, how would you say the spread of these viewpoints from faculty has impacted the student population? And if you could elaborate further than what you've already stated in terms of the actual impact on students.
Thank you so much for this question. So first of all, we have to note that there has been a systematic purging of certain viewpoints from Columbia University and other universities. It used to be the case that students who were interested in engaging in critical thinking could go and listen to the professor you mentioned, Joseph Massad, hear his viewpoints, which I completely disagree with, and then go and sit on a different class with a professor with opposing viewpoints who actually believes that Jews do have a right to exist, and the students will have some balanced point of view. The problem is that throughout 2, 3, or 4 decades, there has been a purge of professors who disagree with people like Professor Massad, Hamid Dabishi, and the sorts. And now students are just not educated, they're indoctrinated. When you are only allowed to listen to one point of view, then you end up either agreeing with that point of view because you didn't get any opposing views, or you drop out of the class. There have been experiences of students that feel like they have to write papers that oppose their own values just to get a passing grade. So I believe that's a huge problem for education.
Right, thank you. Ms. Rohr, I want to talk briefly about the 501c3 part of our tax code and that exempt purpose. We could talk probably a long time in addition to the discussion here in terms of tax exempt status and what does that do for students. It certainly doesn't seem to lower the tuition much, but especially when students would feel harassed in the environment where these institutions have massive and generous tax breaks that they take advantage of. What would you say is the impact of students themselves?
Universities are using their federally allocated funds to fund hateful student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine and its fellow organizations that essentially organize and spew hatred. So universities are now using federal funds that they get through, if I'm not mistaken.
Federal funds would be even different than the tax exempt status that is enjoyed by these institutions. So, but it's resources nonetheless.
They're using their very exorbitant amount of power and wealth to fund anti-American students promoting hatred and anti-Americanism.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many of the chants and taunts since October 7th have fueled anti-Semitism, and the incidents that you described today are truly outrageous. I've joined one resolution after another, one letter after another to condemn and respond, including the important and very appropriate recommendations of the Anti-Defamation League, such as the Never Again Education Act and the Department of Education's Open Center to Combat Anti-Semitism. At the same time, I took this position not after October 7th, but throughout my life, and particularly on August 12, 2017, condemning those white nationalists that marched through Charlottesville with their torches yelling, "Jews will not replace us." Unlike President Trump, I did not find good people on both sides. Rather, I saw dangerous racists and anti-Semites on one side. Yet Trump could not bring himself to treat neo-Nazis and the KKK any differently than Vladimir Putin. Never a genuine word of criticism. Even today, our colleagues had to push back this very hearing in order to meet with the former president, who very recently said that Jews, like our former colleague Ted Deutsch, who don't vote for him, quote, hate their religion and hate Israel. I think we need a broad concept of what anti-Semitism is and that it applies there also. I also reject the opposition and the attacks that have occurred on and off campuses to the very concept of a democratic Jewish state, which I support. There were no Palestinian martyrs on October 7th, only murderers and rapists. Our hope, though, of saving the lives of innocent Palestinian women and children is diminished by every protest that can be discredited as anti-Semitic and every action that drives our neighbors away instead of causing more of them to recognize the true nature of the catastrophe that is ongoing today that results from Netanyahu's indiscriminate bombing and unwillingness to facilitate essential humanitarian aid to the Gazan people. In confronting rising anti-Semitism, we need equal concern about rising Islamophobia and hateful acts against Muslims, blaming the innocent for what they did not cause. I believe in policies and practices that protect all individuals, Jewish and Muslim, from hate and discrimination. This includes robust reporting mechanisms for anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents, comprehensive anti-bias training, as you've urged today, and a zero tolerance on hate speech and discrimination. Anti-Semitism should not be weaponized as a way to attack those of us who disagree with the policies of Israel's ultra-right government, and specifically with the self-serving actions of Netanyahu and his partner Ben Gvir. Such misapplication only demeans the term anti-Semitic. And today, one of our Republican witnesses is here to take the misuse of anti-Semitism a step further by arguing that, quote, a main contributor to the new left anti-Semitism is atmospheric, the radical diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI ideology. Such claims not only misconstrue diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also basically pit one minority group against another. DEI responds to decades of systematic exclusion of people of color from higher education in states like mine in Texas. It seeks to create a culture of respect and understanding for all. Both communities of color and Jewish Americans are all too familiar with the very real prejudice that they've endured. Shared mistreatment has often united them to stand up together against injustice. With the University of Texas at Austin yielding to legislative pressure to shutter the Multicultural Engagement Center, we lost a home away from home, as many students describe it. It is a center where, as Congressman Deutsch has suggested, there ought to be a place to educate about Jewish history and anti-Semitism. I don't say that every DEI program across the country has been without fault, but we should be finding common ground there. And it is a mystery to me why the Republican leadership here continues to refuse to permit a vote on Congressman Kathy Manning's H.R. 7921, Countering Anti-Semitism Act, to establish a national coordinator to oversee an interagency task force to counter anti-Semitism. It should have been approved long ago. We live in a time here in America and in the Middle East where neither side can appreciate the well-justified pain of the other. Together, we've got to seek to overcome the fear and the pain to promote more understanding and capitalize on the talents of all Americans. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. It's amazing that we think we can have a meeting of the Ways and Means Committee to come together to try to figure out what the heck is wrong with what's going on in the world today. The seeds of hate are sown long before the freshman year. They're sown at home by mothers and fathers, grandmas and grandpas, aunts and uncles and families. When we don't teach our children early on that hate is wrong at any level and in any people at all, I am amazed that we think there's a political answer to a human problem. We can pass all the laws we can. That doesn't mean they can be enforced or that the people will even accept that that's a law that I have to follow. We're having a debate today, a political debate that goes far beyond politics. This is absolutely incredible that we think that somehow these seeds of hate that are sown at a very early age and then fanned as the child grows can be corrected by a law. It goes far deeper than that. I think it's appalling that we think we have to call a committee hearing to address something that's so fundamental in the raising of our children. We have destroyed the nuclear family with different government programs. We've encouraged people to not try to get better, to try to get more understanding, to try to become a better person, and we've tried to substitute a government-funded existence that is the worst thing to do to any human being. Ted, it's good to see you again. I got to tell you, I just lost a really good friend of mine not too long ago. We used to drive to high school together, and he was Jewish, and the things that he had to go through were absolutely appalling to me. We sit here today and think that a law can be passed to outlaw hate. And we know the drivers of most of this stuff that happens at our highest universities, it's funding. My gosh, we can't lose that stream of funding, so let's try to accommodate that. No, what we need to do is quit accommodating the type of behavior that we're seeing taking place, not just here in America, but around the world. It is absolutely appalling that human beings can look at each other and hate each other for something that they believe in. I wish there was a law, and there is a law from a much higher source than men can do on their own. I have no questions of you other than to say, thank you for taking a time out of your life to come here again to talk to people who love to turn in everything into a political answer as opposed to common decency. If it doesn't start at home, you can't expect it to grow. And if it's not supported by mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles, grandmas and grandpas, and neighbors, why do we wonder that we see these things happen by people who are in the highest places of education and say, how can they be so filled with hate? And how can we sit back and think that somehow we're going to pass a law that changes that? The law we need to pass is you're a mom and dad. It's your responsibility. It is your responsibility. There's no law that can be enacted that can stop this from happening. Recognizing it is one thing. Accepting it is not an alternative. So thank you all for being here. I have no questions of you because we've talked before. We've talked before and things have only gotten worse. And somehow we think it's a fault of a previous administration or somebody who didn't do this or didn't do that. And we say, please, find a mirror and take the longest look you can at the reflection and say, what have I done as an individual to make sure that my children don't grow up hate-filled, but rather thankful for the country they live in and their opportunity to actually make a change or a difference in the world, a positive change. Well, thank you again so much for doing this. I am baffled by our continuance to have meeting after meeting, hearing after hearing, to think, who is it that's responsible for all this hate-filled part of our society? Find a mirror. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Thompson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. You know, in the months since October 7th, communities across our country and in my district have had to grapple with enhanced anti-Semitism. On campuses in my district, Jewish students have been harassed and threatened. There have been bloody handprints left on buildings. There's chants and signs of "from the river to the sea." Even Jewish high school students in my district have hate messages sent to them by fellow students. This is absolutely cruel, it's unacceptable, and it has to stop. I vehemently defend Americans' right to assemble, to free speech, and to protest, and I always will. But when Jewish students are being signaled out, targeted, harassed, made to feel unsafe, that's not peaceful protest. It's not peaceful assembly. Reasonable people can and do disagree about Israel and Palestine, but we should all agree that students should be able to study and to learn free of any harassment, let alone religious bigotry. Along with all my colleagues on this dais, I too believe anti-Semitism is appalling and has no place in our society. Congressman Deutsch, good to see you here today. You mentioned that there's things that universities need to do to improve the situation on campuses, and you spoke to that in response to Chairman Neal's questions. But could you talk about the physical security measures that may be needed to ensure a safe and peaceful place from which students can learn?
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. And I don't want to take away from your time, but I just want to acknowledge that the question that Mr. Kelly asked about what can I do individually is a question that I think really all of us need to ask, and I appreciated that. Mr. Thompson, there's as we've seen this dramatic increase in threats to Jewish students on campus, threats of violence since 10/7, the university has a responsibility to meet the potential security needs. It's true in religious and cultural places on campus. It's true in gatherings on campus so that there is adequate security, that they don't have to shut down events in the middle, send people home because they're not equipped with adequate security. It's so that they don't have to cancel an event that was meant to be a public event only to shuffle the participants to an undisclosed location in a significantly smaller number because that's all they're able to help secure. And it means ensuring that the speakers who come through that have the security that they need so that you don't wind up losing the opportunity to hear from Israeli voices and hear from Jewish voices who are told don't come to our campus because it's just not safe for you. There have been now 150, Mr. Marcus confirmed this, more than 150 schools that have open Title VI investigations. The Title VI cases are important. I mentioned earlier, universities should have Title VI offices so that they're starting to focus on these issues, including physical security, in a way to address them directly.
Thank you very much. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Snyder.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Marcus, if I can turn to you a little bit, and it's a broad question, but I'll set up for later. The protests we're seeing on campus, the professors and scholars coming out to join or even lead changing curriculums in their campuses, is that something new, or is this something that we've seen on campuses for a long period of time?
So, Mr. Schneider, we have seen protesters on campus for a long period.
I'm talking about the professors, the academic scholars. For example, with the ASA and other associations supporting anti-Israel positions and rhetoric.
We've seen protests, but they're protests and they're protests. And we've seen faculty engaged in protests, but not at this level. Now we have a much greater politicization, a much greater polarization, much greater involvement in faculty. And let's admit it, there's a difference between protesting a war in which one could say that there are, issues of justice. It's very different when you look at a so-called protest that began even before the Israeli Defense Forces encroached into Gaza, a so-called protest that began as soon as the Hamas atrocities became publicized. These are not just protests. These are extremist support for terrorist actions. The fact that faculty are supporting that in many cases, this is unprecedented and shouldn't be compared to prior protest activity.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Schweikert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Okay, we're going to try to go through a couple things here. First off, and Mr. Chairman, I fear, and I know our scope is tax money, universities, those things. But I am incredibly concerned that the almost evil crazy that I see coming in on my own personal phone, the fact of the matter, and Congressman Deutsch would be able to process this, you open up your phones on Monday morning and start having your staff go through your voicemails, and there's hundreds and hundreds of actually burn civil society down, just almost evil. And my fear is much of it is a bot. It's the use of technology. How much of the mind bending from the people who used to have the bumper sticker, it would say coexist, to now it's a bumper sticker of a Palestinian flag with a weapon attached to it. What has snapped here? And my fear, Mr. Chairman, as we do our little piece here on universities and how much of this is foreign influence money and other things falling through the process, Are we capable as members of Congress having a societal discussion of the financiers and generation of hate that seem to be coming in from foreign entities, maybe even from some fairly sick entities in my own country? And it's burning down, the potential of burning down civil society across the world. Congressman Deutsch, you won't remember, but years ago, you and I had sort of a side conversation on some of this, and my fear, the use of technology to push anti-Semitism, and that it's a handful of people who bought bots and natural language, chat. How much do you believe of this evil is being pumped into our society and manipulating young people's brains and even other people's brains is being financed from outsiders?
Well, we know, we know a couple of things clearly. We know that state actors are involved in this effort to help divide the people of the United States from one another. We've seen the same thing. This is the playbook that the Russians have used around the world and have done the same thing here. We know that the Iranians and other state actors are also involved. And this is one where I defer to the House and my former colleagues to continue to make sure that that is a focus. We also know, though, that when it comes to funding, the questions that are being asked are important, and the effort, the Deterrent Act that seeks to impose penalties for non-compliance with disclosures, I think is important. At the same time, I think that I would just suggest, please.
No, you're going, because you're going exactly where I want. Can you help young persons, older people, people who, that get their news from fringe crazy things here, understand through that disclosure, you're being manipulated, you're being used, these people are trying to exploit you?
Right. I think it's important to remember that while there is a serious effort to do that's coming from the outside, what they're manipulating is the algorithms of the social media companies. I think we should start by expecting that the social media companies enforce their own rules about the kind of content on their platforms that put Jewish students in particular in recent months in harm's way.
Mr. Chairman, the former congressman sort of went, I wish we as a body could have a more holistic discussion, because today it's anti-Semitism. It's burning down and moving back to a historic evil. And it will tear civil society apart. And look, I have pieces of legislation to try to provide more flexibility for the Religious Institution Security Act, because how many of my shuls actually now have to have armed guards there and things of that nature. I wish we would actually look at a number of these ways we can protect each other. And then we have to have a conversation again. What the hell happened when they're wonderful people, when my leftist neighbor pulled off the coexist bumper sticker and went the other direction? What snapped? I'm not smart enough to understand it, but I'm actually quite worried, not only for my Jewish community, but for my country. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. LaHood is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing today. I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today and your passion. Welcome back, Congressman Deutsch. Good to have you here. Since the atrocious terrorist attacks committed by Hamas on October 7th, we've seen widespread anti-Semitic activity on our college campuses, as has been alluded to today. One estimate reporting a 321% increase from 2022. What's worse, we have seen a complete lack of leadership by university leaders and campus administrators at many institutions, leaving Jewish students, faculty, alumni, and community members without any actual protection or support. As we continue to see this anti-Semitism rage on college campuses, I think it's important to consider the U.S. Department of Education's role here as well. As many of you know, Title VI of the Higher Education Act prohibits discrimination based on national origin and shared ancestry. Among other things, and it's supposed to be enforced by the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, also known as OCR. Unfortunately, OCR too frequently settles these cases with schools through resolution agreements instead of making a final determination about whether Title VI violation actually occurred. As a result, it appears that many schools avoid scrutiny and accountability for their actions by implementing short-term remedial corrective actions as directed by the Department of Education. Mr. Marcus, appreciate your public service. As we look at this ability of the Department of Education and their Office of Civil Rights to enforce Title VI violations, I'm just curious, as we look at the last 8 months and what's gone on in these college campuses, I'm curious what you think, your opinion on whether the Biden administration has done a good job in enforcing Title VI and handling these complaints of anti-Semitism that we've seen across the country.
Thank you, Congressman LaHood. I think that this administration has done some things well with respect to anti-Semitism, especially in outreach, public messaging, and transparency. But the investigations have been extremely slow. The policy formulations have been weak. There have been too few in the way of resolutions, and there have been dismissals that I think are hard to defend. So I would say it has been a mixed bag, and I would also say that you make a good point about the problem that some cases that should lead to a final disposition and perhaps punishments are resolved perhaps prematurely, but in ways that the statute may require, because by statute, OCR must seek a voluntary resolution, and in some cases, that does weaken their response.
Can you give us any examples in the last 8 months where there's been a determination that's been done that will send a deterrent message to this type of behavior by universities?
No, sir, not in the last 8 months with respect to a university. With respect to the Davidson School, which is K-12 in the last month, perhaps. With respect to the last maybe 16 months, the University of Vermont. So there have been a couple of cases that have sent useful signals, but not enough, not recently enough, and especially not recently with respect to higher education.
Well, I would agree with that. Can you tell me if a proper civil judgment was put in place against a university or a college through the Title VI process, tell me what that would do in terms of sending a message from a financial standpoint and a deterrent message of the consequences for the lack of enforcement.
So monetary judgments can sometimes be available under Title VI with a private lawsuit, but those are expensive, not available to everyone, and time-consuming. Under the OCR process, there are very few instances in which money damages are available. If there were an ability to get money damages, it would presumably provide a nice incentive effect. I think that that would be a useful addition to the process.
Is it your recommendation that we ought to think about statutory changes to make the enforcement mechanism stronger and more robust?
Yes, sir. The process it's slow, it's weak, and I think it would be useful to consider strengthening it, not just for Jewish students, but for all.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses, especially Talia, and for all you've been through. We appreciate your testimony and your passion and commitment. Also, Mr. Chairman, I want to commend, this is not often on the committee do we see unanimity in terms of the forthright concern about anti-Semitism. And some of the compelling testimony and also some of the compelling questions from our colleagues. Along the lines
lines of what a number of members have said, I wanted to ask our former colleague, Mr. Deutsch, especially because you're so familiar with the process. I would like to submit for the record a report from the Department of Education that shows that the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights has received a record number of discrimination complaints while losing department staff. And so that kind of cuts to the question that Mr. Marcus was asked as well, et cetera. And also plays to your response with regard to the administration. If your budget is cut and you have record number of complaints and we're not receiving the resources and the Department of Education isn't able to meet these critical cases, what happens, especially when cases are put forward and they're left open for months? Mr. Deutsch, could you respond to that?
Sure. First, just to follow up on Mr. Marcus's point, I think, in your exchange with Mr. LaHood, I think it's really important for the department to be very clear about what the potential repercussions are for universities, so that everyone understands what the result of these cases could be, where these could lead. The fact that they're now, it's a step forward, that they're now disclosing the number of cases, I think it's really important to be clear about what the penalties are. And then at the same time, the good news is there are so many good news, bad news. Because of the situation we're in, there's a crisis, but they're stepping up to meet the crisis and launching these investigations. The problem is there aren't sufficient investigators. There aren't enough resources. I agree with Mr. Marcus that it's slow. The workload for each of the investigators almost guarantees that. They need additional funding so that you can bulk up the staff at this moment when these more investigators will mean a greater and a faster response.
Thank you. I agree with Mr. Marcus as well with regard to that. And I also agree that there's no one on this committee on this issue that has as much passion as Mr. Schneider, and I will yield to him my remaining time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pick up where I left off. I asked Mr. Marcus about what he'd seen in the past. Professor Davidai, you've kind of been outspoken and you've experienced it. And first, let me apologize. I conflated Columbia with Cornell. I know, Talia, you graduated from Cornell, as did you, Professor Davidai, so, but you're at Columbia now. And we saw this almost with a flip of a switch on October 7th, the protests come out. Could you touch a little bit on what you saw on October 7th and 8th on Columbia, as far as what the protests, including from professors, looked like?
Yeah, actually, I disagree with the premise. This was not a switch that changed. This is something that has been for decades. There's been a movie in 2004 called Columbia Unbecoming about the anti-Semitic professors, many who I have mentioned in my testimony. Columbia has known about this and done nothing about that. You asked about protests before. Well, in 2005, or starting in 2005, Professor George Saliba used to cancel classes so his students can attend anti-Israel protests. What we have seen is not a switch, it's just an increase in the vehemence. And it actually points to the question Mr. Schweikart asked of what snapped. Nothing snapped. If you look around, the vast majority of your colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, are not here. They didn't see this as a top priority. So their constituents and the students around the country, they see that anti-Semitism, support for terrorism, is not a priority for the House. So why wouldn't they go and protest?
Okay, thank you. I am going to challenge you, though. We have oftentimes 2-3 hearings all at the same time. There's a budget hearing going on as we're talking now.
That's why I said a priority. I didn't say they don't want to be here. They have other priorities.
It's not a matter of priority. We come, we go. People will be here. You'll see them coming throughout this. This is a priority. That's why we have this hearing. It is a priority. That's why we have had legislation come to the floor. And we need to make sure it stays a priority. We elevate it. And as Mr. Larson said, this is something that on both sides of the aisle, in this committee, Republicans and Democrats are focused on.
I respectfully disagree. I have to say, their priorities are, the top priority is where you show up, and this is not the top priority. It's a second, third, or fourth priority.
Mr. Davidai, I completely agree with you. I believe members of this committee were asked to serve on this committee, and they should be present, and it's all about priorities. We're busy people, but this is the most important committee in Congress, and that is why people should be in their seats. Dr. Winstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to give a heartfelt thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. You've been through a lot. And before I begin, I'd like to submit a statement for the record on behalf of my good friend, Dr. Murphy, who could not attend the hearing today due to a personal medical issue. Dr. Murphy's a former member of the Board of Trustees at Davidson College, so he has firsthand knowledge of the seismic shift we are seeing on college campuses today. And frankly, I find it disheartening and profoundly disappointing that we are all here once again, forced to reckon with this virulent anti-Semitism that has only grown worse since we last convened in November in the wake of the October 7 attacks. It's very disappointing. You know, what I see happening on our college campuses, to me, is anti-American, it's anti-Jewish, it's anti-freedom. And to me, these are nothing more. Some of these campuses have become nothing more than treasonous cells and terrorist cells. Mr. Rohr, you've been terrorized, and so have many others. I don't know what people are supposed to do for a college education for their kids today. You know, maybe we can go to homeschooling for college. I don't know where we're supposed to go. We need to consider where we allow our tax dollars to go. Our president wants to pay off student loans, even for those that hate America. And it's the very taxpayers whose money it would take to do so. What are we doing? You know, it's not just universities. It's throughout. It's in sports. It's everywhere else. I had a NFL running back one time get in my face that I haven't done enough to promote DEI. I didn't see him promoting DEI for his offensive line. It was merit-based, wasn't it? And though many institutions, their intentions may be good, and when we see this in professional sports, you know, not all teams are playing along with the negativity. What I'd much rather see in end zones today is maybe something as simple as love your neighbor. That seems to me to cover it all, and we'd be much better off. So I think about what can we do here in this body? Besides greater awareness, that only goes so far. Professor, you just alluded to that. It's very difficult. But I will say this, and I allow any one of you to answer the question. What would happen if we cut off federal funds to any university that was allowing these types of things to go on their campuses?
So I would say that even before you cut it off, your knees will start shaking and change will happen. We have to remember Columbia University is the largest private landlord in New York City, and it is a tax-exempt largest private landlord. They own the land of Rockefeller Center. They own most of Morningside Heights and many of the buildings in Harlem. You know, if only the thought of losing that tax exemption would pass through their minds, you would see no more anti-Semitism. You won't see any misdoing anything on campus, because these universities, and I've spent a lot of time in these universities, they're not elite universities, they're expensive universities. All they care about is money and PR. And if you start playing with that, things will change.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I couldn't agree more, and I would like to actually take this moment to thank Mr. Smith for his investigation. Every single positive action I've seen out of Cornell in the past 7 months have been the result of the pressure of this committee. I have a lot to be grateful for, but I do think that you will see tangible results when you place pressure on these universities that think that they are allergic to any form of punishment.
May I add one thing? Thank you for the question. I think the premise behind the tax exemption is that these are institutions that are organized and operated exclusively for educational purposes. Universities don't look today what they looked like 50 years ago. They have $4, $5, $6 billion budgets. They manage wealth equivalent to a large hedge fund. They sell a lavish college experience, luxury dorms, gourmet food, subsidized by taxpayers. They operate multi-million or billion-dollar research labs. They hire teams of lobbyists. Some have hundreds of millions in foreign revenue. They run DEI programs that understand their purpose as being to re-engineer American society. That's a political purpose. That is not an educative function. Elite universities are simply no longer driven by truth-seeking or education as their guiding ethos.
Anyone else? Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Ferguson.
Thanks, Chairman Smith, and thanks to each of you for being here. I want you to think about time in our nation's history when we actually had universities that would discriminate against African Americans on admissions policies. How horrible do we think that that was and is, and it should never happen again? And I'll take you back to the case of the United States versus Bob Jones University, where because of their racially discriminatory policies, their tax-exempt status was removed. And in studying the case, and keep in mind, I'm a dentist playing lawyer up here, so you'll have to excuse my very simplistic method here. But it seems that we're in very similar territory right now, where you have universities that are clearly violating the civil rights of its students. And Honorable Marcus, could you weigh in on, do you think that there's similarities in the violation of the student civil rights today that is like what happened with Bob Jones University? And do you think that that should be reason for the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of these universities that continue to violate the civil rights of their students?
Congressman Ferguson, you have raised an important issue. I don't think we need to compare the discrimination that Jewish students face to those of African Americans to realize that there is a problem, and a problem that's not being taken seriously enough. Universities are responding to OCR investigations. They are responding to lawsuits. However, most universities are virtually addicted to federal funding and tax exemption. If any university was seriously threatened with either one of them, it would create a massive change within both that university and also its peers around the country. Right now, we don't have that sort of incentive effect. We don't have the sort of action that you described with respect to Bob Jones University. But if we had that sort of forcefulness, it would get a very different sort of reaction than what we've been seeing.
So, look, I'm pragmatic and I'm a political realist. And we could go through the process of writing legislation and passing laws. I don't know that how many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would move to advance this, particularly in the U.S. Senate. And I have really no hope that the current administration would sign it into law, much less enforce it. However, there is precedent to do this administratively with the IRS. And it seems to me that a very similar type of environment exists here. And I'm just wondering when student groups or different advocacy groups would actually look at suing these universities to have their tax-exempt status removed for violation of the Civil Rights Act. In addition to that, not only should the IRS look at it administratively following their guidelines from previous cases, but I think they should even think about introducing not only removing the tax-exempt status, but possibly a financial penalty as well. If these schools are going to receive federal funds And if they don't do that, there should be some sort of clawback or even some sort of penalty. Professor, could you speak to that?
Yeah, I really appreciate your pragmatism. Like you, I don't like big ideas that are not rooted in reality. So I would say the most pragmatic thing is for Americans to understand what they are funding, right? Like we talk about universities as this broad thing.
Professor, I think this committee and our chairman have done a great job of really looking at that piece of it. But in the end, there's got to be a mechanism or a lever that can be pulled that has a profound effect on their behavior. And it seems to me, and Doctor, if you could weigh in on this very quickly, that removal of the tax-exempt status, as it has been, and that tool has been used in the past by the IRS, it seems like that would be a very effective tool and also a financial penalty for the violation of student rights and while they're receiving federal funds.
One
Professor,
thing.
do you mind if I let Doctor?
Oh, because I would just say, sorry, but one thing that I would say, once the university's budgets get hurt, this will be affecting the professor's budget. And once the professor's salaries and research budgets get hurt, they will upkeep the norms and push out the hateful professors from amidst them.
So, very quickly, Mr. Chairman, do you mind if we respond?
Proceed quickly.
So my opinion is that only strong financial incentives will change behavior. One of the things we've observed in the last 8 months is that universities that don't have tremendous amounts of resources, they don't have this problem. And the reason they don't have this problem is because they don't have money to waste on highly ideological, divisive programs. They focus on educating. And so if we constrain the funding, universities will have to make choices, and some of them will redirect their resources to their educational mission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquarello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for putting us together this morning on this very important topic. Each witness was excellent, I thought. And I think, Mr. Chairman, it's good to point out the fact that some of our brothers and sisters have left. They probably have other assignments. But don't forget, we were a half hour late. We were a half hour late starting the committee to begin with, and I'm not trying to be the wise guy, but what's fair is fair here. The children are listening. Don't think they're not listening. So we could compare notes since October the 7th to talk about how our families have been put in jeopardy, perhaps, to fill a book. But we must protect also what I would call academia. We're not going to solve this problem by threatening academia. We haven't in the past on other issues. I agree to some degree with my brother from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, that the law and your heart are two different things. We know that. But we are a nation of laws. We made that decision a long time ago. And balancing those laws is difficult. It's complex. That's why we have a legislature. That's why we have an executive. That's why we have a Supreme Court. Regardless of how you like them or you don't like them, that's why we have three branches of government, to try to check and balance. So you're not going to solve this problem and threaten academia. And free speech is very important and very critical. When it interrupts the comfort of a student trying to learn at a college, we have a right to stand and protest that, to get the institution who allows it to happen to wake up. I think that's critical. I studied the anatomy of what happened in Charlottesville. I studied it very carefully. From the 2 days before it happened till the time when, what was his name? We forgot his name already. James Fields killed a counter-protester, Heather Heyer. Studied it very carefully of what started off. The neo-Nazis that ran the park 2 nights in a row. And what they chanted. Study what they chanted and what it meant. We got major problems here. And you cannot equivocate. You cannot say there's good and bad in each of the groups and everything like that that we heard. Democrats and Republicans have not done the job as they should. But the children are listening. And the first people they listened to were their parents. Listen to what Mr. Kelly said. The parents, us. A wink and a blink gets you by sometimes, but it causes a tremendous amount of damage. Tens of millions of Americans have been shocked, disgusted by the anti-Semitic poison we have seen in college campuses. The displays at many of these campuses are a disgrace. Administrators, faculty at some of these schools have fostered environments of intolerance, ignorance, and cruelty in the name of free speech. In the name of free speech. No, we're not going to solve this by law, but if we quiet and we don't speak up our minds and are not afraid to stand even when the crowd may not be with us. It's easy to talk to everybody who agrees with us. We're in bad shape, worse shape than I thought. So I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that this be an ongoing situation until not only we cool the waters, but we see progress on the campuses so that we define what free speech is and what it is not. And when I'm on a campus to learn and I don't feel comfortable even to go to class, that's horrific. And I will not tolerate it as a legislator, so get rid of me then. Try. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I hope we have another one soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Steele is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing, and thank you for all the witnesses coming in. I'm not here to lecture you because you know more than I do about anti-Semitism and what's going on with the campus, but we must ensure that schools are fulfilling their educational purpose as required to maintain tax-exempt status under the law. But Professor Davidai just said that, just take that tax-exempt status away. I don't think that's enough because we have to do more than that. So my bill, the Deterrent Act, would add transparency, accountability, and clarity to colleges and universities and hold them accountable for foreign funds they receive, and I hope that Senate will pass it immediately because we see that Qatar, pro-Hamas Hamas countries that, they are actually pouring money in, hundreds of millions of dollars to these universities. When we had a hearing at the Education Committee, I asked those university presidents, they're the one raising funds for their universities, and I asked them that how much you received the money from Qatar. They decided not to answer. Actually, they said they're gonna come back to us. But you know what, we didn't get any answers because they all resigned from their positions. So I really wanna see that how much we really pour money into brainwashing our students. Just brainwashing, you know what, we have to teach our kids how to think instead of just brainwashing and spreading these propagandas. So we really have to change these campuses. And another thing is when we actually take tax money away, it's not, as of now, actually, it's not even going to the classes or professors. It goes to the administration. We have these prominent universities has much, much bigger administration than actually this money going into the classrooms. So we have to really watch out that how much is really going to the classrooms and students, that, we really have to change that. So Mr. Marcus, when students are assaulted during campus events, because I just saw that, I think you all did too on the video, UCLA is one of the prominent college. I didn't go there, I went to USC, so it's, I think USC is much better school than UCLA. But having said that one of the Jewish students at UCLA was kicked in the face. They took his yarmulke off, and this anti-Israel protester during a pro-Palestinian encampment, that this protester was chasing him with the taser. It should not happen on the campus. So, do you think it's a good indicator that schools are fulfilling their educational purpose as required by law, and what we have to do? I think I'm asking Mr. Marcus about this.
Well, Congresswoman Steele, I think that it's fair to say that when students are assaulted in that way, they are prevented from enjoying an equal opportunity to an education, no question about it. I would also say that on many campuses, there is a permissiveness towards masked students. And then the university said, well, what can we do about it? We can't identify the perpetrator. Well, they don't have to permit the masks in the first place, and they certainly can take action after it happens, if not also before. Yes, indeed.
How about those that UCLA had the mandatory meeting that lecturer led the students in a free Palestine chant? I don't know you guys all read or you guys all watched or not, but Mr. Marcus, based on what you've seen, can you speak to the role that radical faculty like this play in the anti-Semitism occurring across the college campuses?
Look, there are good faculty and not good faculty, but too often we're seeing faculty members who are promoting this in a lot of different ways. There's been discussion today about faculty members who actually join in bigoted protest activities. But even beyond that, there are faculty members who encourage it through their teaching, through the doctrines they adopt, through the ways in which they use the bully pulpit, as it were, to spread hate towards the Jewish people, towards Israeli Americans and others. We could look at all of the new policies we would like from administration, but as long as faculty are fomenting this hate, we're really not going to solve the problem.
Dr. Pedruzuni, if I pronounced it right, if I didn't do it, I'm sorry. I understand that you have written about this previously, that about what are your thoughts on what schools could do better combat the rise of anti-Semitism on their campuses and the role that radical faculty are playing in it?
Thank you for the question, and I applaud the Deterrent Act. Thank you for all that work. I think we know from empirical research that universities with pro-BDS, anti-Zionist faculty see higher levels of student-on-student harassment, and we know that those faculty are funded by foreign entities. So I would say the first thing that they should do is they should audit their foreign gifts. That's one thing that OCR should ask universities to do as it starts to reach some settlement agreements. Audit your foreign gifts and disclose their purpose to the Department of Education. Another thing that I think they could do is audit their academic programs. Is there intense anti-Israel bias in public affairs? If there is intense intellectual bias in public affairs disciplines, bring viewpoint diversity to those disciplines so that students hear two sides.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. Since this committee met in December of last year, not only has anti-Semitism on college campuses grown worse, it has also morphed into anti-American rhetoric as well. And several institutions that we've heard today have placated the mob of violent protesters who have terrorized Jewish students. And we all worry, I think, about what the situation will look like when classes resume at the end of the summer. At an earlier hearing, I'd asked about the impact of foreign money from adversarial nations or nations that don't have our own interest in mind, the impact of that money on domestic higher education system. For example, Qatar has contributed $4.7 billion to U.S. academic institutions from 2001 to 2021. It's the same country that harbors leaders of Hamas in Doha, finances Hamas, and blamed Israel for the October 7th attacks. The University of Pennsylvania, in my state, received $130 million in donations from China from 2018 to 2023, including from individuals with ties to the CCP. And of course, that's the same CCP which has falsely accused Israel of being an oppressor nation and took the side of South Africa in calling Israel's response to the October 7 terror attacks a genocide. Mr. Podlesny, and I hope I got the name close to right, most higher education institutions are tax-exempt organizations under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. This was discussed briefly, but when this section of the tax code was created, do you believe it was intended to be leveraged by foreign governments?
Absolutely not. I said a moment ago, I think you may have not been in the room, that the university's tax-exempt status is based on their being organized and operated exclusively for educational purposes. And I think if you go back 50 years, that probably is true of the vast majority of universities. They take educating very seriously. Today, I'm in the habit of recommending that young people don't go to an elite university, as when I was a university professor, or that they don't go to an R1 research university, because the faculty are in their labs doing research, they're mentoring their graduate students, and they aren't interested in undergraduate education. So today, our university systems, or our multiversities, they are not focused on education, right? They are focused on disseminating an ideology, right? Administrative spending is through the roof. Some universities have more administrators than they have undergraduates.
So you would agree that it certainly is not within the spirit of the law for foreign governments to directly or indirectly promote their agendas at colleges and universities?
Of course not. The New York Times.
Do you think? And I'm sorry, I just don't have a lot of time. Do you think these institutions that receive foreign donations should be subject to taxes on those donations?
I think that's an idea worth exploring, because the only way to change behavior will be financial levers.
Do you know if foreign universities, just by comparison, do they accept donations or grants from American citizens, institutions, or the federal government?
That's not something I've studied.
Yeah, and I wonder if they do, how do foreign countries regulate or monitor those grants? Do you have any? Do you know at all?
I'm not aware, no.
Mr. Marcus, you've seen how the Education Department has failed at properly enforcing Title VI. Do you believe that foreign donations, which fund certain faculty fellowships or departmental chairs, have influenced the curriculum at these institutions?
Foreign governments and foreign entities are pumping a large amount of money into U.S. universities, and it's hard to imagine that it is having no influence, and particularly no deleterious influence. At the same time, I would have to say that we're doing a weak job on our own, particularly when it comes to our elementary and secondary schools, which are now themselves also a source of anti-Semitism, which then creates worse problems in higher education.
Sure. What transparency do we have now, or what could we do to ensure that there is transparency around these foreign grants, which potentially shape the school curriculum?
We do have rules that require disclosure of foreign contributions to U.S. universities, but weak enforcement systems and little in the way of penalties when they fail to do so. As a result, there has been widespread failure to report over the years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I don't think we can discuss the issues enough that we are discussing now. I want to thank all of the witnesses for the care and attention that you have given to your responses and to your positions. As I listen to the discussion, I'm reminded of something that President John Kennedy said one time discussing peace. And he said that peace is not only found in treaties, covenants, and charters, but in the hearts of men. And I guess if he was alive, he probably would say the hearts of men and women. So I think we look for many places for answers and solutions. It's so good to see you, Ted. And I'm very interested in the work that you are doing. And I assume that the purpose of our hearing is to try and reduce anti-Semitism, reduce the rise, reduce discrimination, reduce hatred, reduce all of those negative things that we are saying exist on college campuses. And I guess not only on college campuses, because they exist in many other places, many other organizational entities, and all of the places where people do business. Representative Deutsch, let me ask you, because I think if we take or if we allow ourselves to take a deeper dive into the history of our nation, the history of our Constitution, the history of how America got to be the America that it is, that many people would have different levels of understanding and different views. So my first question to you is, do you think if we studied history more in our elementary and high schools, or leading up to college campuses, that by the time individuals get there, their views may be different than some of what is being expressed?
Representative Davis, thank you. It's good to see you as well. The answer to that is absolutely yes. The challenge, and Mr. Marcus just alluded to this, the challenge is that now in too many elementary and middle and high schools, we've seen, just as we're seeing on college campuses, we're seeing an attempt to erase the Jewish contribution in America, to specifically exclude the Jewish community, to refuse to acknowledge the existence of anti-Semitism. And the problem, I want to make one point, Congressman Davis, that's not been made because it should be obvious. The reason all of this, the reason that everything that Professor Davidai has experienced is so relevant to everything we're discussing. Our own survey shows that over 80% of American Jews, over 80%, say that caring about Israel is important to what being Jewish means to them. With that understanding, Congressman Davis, yes, we need people to better understand the facts about the Jewish community, the facts about Israel, the facts about the history of anti-Semitism that did not start on October 8th, that for millennia, this is what we've been battling, what that means and why we have to combat it.
You mentioned the need for mandatory anti-Semitism training. Are there examples of
Yes. Sure. AJC has provided training for both high schools and, importantly, universities around the country who will, when they acknowledge the problem on their campus, will come in and provide training to the president and his or her senior staff, or to all of the faculty, or best case, to the entire university community, to help them understand what anti-Semitism is, what the Jewish community is, to help break down the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that so many people aren't even aware that they're using, and to help them understand why anti-Zionism that says that the only state in the world that has no right to exist is the Jewish state has the impact that it does on the Jewish community when you say it, particularly when the way that you say it is to call for death to Zionists.
So we need to do as much in the way of educating as we do trying to change our rules and laws and all of those other things as well. And one is probably as good as the other.
We need to educate, and even as the august members of this committee talk about potential changes to the law, the opportunity right now to go to all of your local universities, all of the universities in the country, and ask the presidents, it's now the middle of June, what are you doing to prepare for what is likely to occur and the threats that will exist for Jewish students when they return in the fall? Now is the time for them to prepare those plans and to share them with the community and with the country.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Congressman, thanks for being here. There are many Jewish families and organizations in my district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who are integral to our community. My district also has a large evangelical population that prays for the peace of Jerusalem, and I'm proud to be one of those. We also have the Sherwin Miller Museum, which hosts a sobering exhibit educating, as you just mentioned, citizens on the realities of the Holocaust. Understanding and remembering history is important if we wish to avoid repeating the horrors of the past, just as my colleague from Illinois just mentioned. Every American should be outraged by what we're seeing across the country. These demonstrations are pro-terrorism and anti-American and should be universally condemned. This isn't just about expression, it's a dangerous endorsement of violence on American soil. It's alarming. Protesters scaling buildings, waving terrorist propaganda, repeating slogans rooted in hatred, barring Jews from entering buildings, holding janitors captive. This isn't activism, it's extremism, borderline terrorism. It's deeply troubling to see the lack of moral clarity in university leaders who refuse to condemn anti-Semitic demonstrations on campuses. It's a sad day in America when parents at school board meetings are deemed terrorists, but Hamas's brutal violence against women and children is defended, even celebrated on our campuses across America. Unfortunately, this confusion and chaos at higher institutions of higher ed is not an anomaly. For decades, prestigious colleges have slowly soiled their reputations by embracing Marxism, Confucius institutes, and moral relativism at the expense of merit, virtue, and truth. Education is no longer the mission. Whether intentionally or not, this is stupidity. Universities have allowed radical ideologies, often funded by the Chinese Communist Party, to indoctrinate our students. Universities have strayed from their academic mission in pursuit of DEI, teaching students to make judgments of people based on race, gender, and sexual identity instead of teaching students to respect every person as an individual with dignity and inherent worth. All is not lost, though. In the face of blatant hatred and anti-Semitism, millions of Americans of all races and religions have shown support, love, and kindness to our Jewish friends and neighbors. Support for Hamas is support for terrorism, plain and simple. Organizations that funnel money to terrorists or take money from known terrorist organizations should not hold tax-exempt status. As members of this Ways and Means Committee, we hold the power of the purse and tax-exempt status. With that power comes great responsibility to provide oversight on charities and universities that potentially abuse their tax-exempt status. American universities continue to receive billions of dollars in the form of taxpayer subsidies, tax breaks, and federal payments, yet anti-Semitic incidences increase on our campus. Higher ed should not continue to receive taxpayer money in the form of federal payments, grants, or tax exemptions if they continue to turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism on their campuses. Dr. Pedaluzzi, I understand you've written extensively about DEI efforts on college campuses, particularly about how these efforts fundamentally alter the course of institutions' academic mission. These are the same institutions that receive billions of taxpayer dollars each year through the tax-exempt status. Do you believe these institutions who either implement DEI policies or promote anti-Semitism are worthy of taxpayer dollars? Should American taxpayers be forced to subsidize this institutional hatred?
Not if they continue once they're warned. So I think universities need to be on warning that this is something this committee is looking at. I'd also like to say a little bit about how profoundly DEI has reshaped these institutions. We're talking about an investment of $25 to $35 million at large universities like University of Texas System or University of Florida System or Berkeley. That's $250 million over a decade, right? That allows an army of activists to incorporate DEI screens into hiring processes, into tenure policies. They create mandatory trainings that teach young people to make snap judgment about each other based on race stereotypes, race exclusionary graduations, bias response teams, forbidden word lists, new curriculum. Right? This has profoundly transformed our institutions.
Thank you. Mr. Marcus, can you tell us what role you've seen DEI programs play in the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses?
Congressman Hearn, I've seen a mixed bag. In candor, we have seen some students who say that the DEI offices have been a help to them when they face anti-Semitism. We've seen many who say that it is not helpful to them. And we have seen some who will say that it is a problem for a few reasons. First, because DEI offices in so many cases fail to even recognize that Jewish students exist or that anti-Semitism is a problem. Second, because they too often have this notion of oppressors and oppressed with nothing in between, and that sort of simplicity isn't helpful. And third, because once they make that division, they too often say, well, Jews are not among the oppressed, they're among the oppressors, and they fall back on stereotypes that are harmful both to Jews and everyone else.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. And Mr. Marcus, if I could with you, and I want to follow up on some line of questioning that Congressman Smucker and Hearn have asked about. In fact, I just looked up, it's been 250 days since the October 7th attacks, which in some ways it seems like longer, in some ways it seems like yesterday, I think, to everybody. This past weekend, with the hostages rescue, by the way, they weren't released, as some news organizations said, they were rescued bravely. We learned that a quote-unquote journalist who was working for the Palestine Chronicle was holding Israeli hostages in his home in Gaza. 3 of the 4 that were released was held by him. And I do want to remind people that the Palestine Chronicle is part of the People Media Project, which is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization based in the United States of America. So I bring all that up. Congressman Snyder and I co-sponsored a bill, H.R. 6408. It's a bill to revoke the tax-exempt status of any nonprofit that provides keywords material support to a designated terrorist group. And I will tell you that I'm proud that this committee passed that bill out of this committee by a vote of 41-0. You know the partisan nature of Washington, that says something. I'm also very proud that the entire body, the entire House of Representatives, passed that bill on April the 15th of this year by a vote of 382 to 11. Again, a very strong vote. My point is this, and I'm coming to my question in just a moment. I think if we want to disrupt the financing behind terrorist and extremist anti-Semitism, we've got to know where the money's coming from in the first place. Now, in your testimony, certainly in your written testimony, you talk about the DOJ investigating. You talk about OCR investigating. So my question to you is, what tools do they have to investigate, to show that from a reporting standpoint or compliance, that it's being done? And then secondly, if I can, from your standpoint, has the Biden administration used the tools that they've got with DOJ or OCR to investigate and go to the root of the funding?
Congressman Kostov, we've not seen the full array of tools being used by any means. Some tools, yes, but certainly not all. During the prior administration, we saw investigations of undisclosed foreign funding in violation of federal law. More of that would be useful. We are seeing some actions by OCR, some by DOJ, but certainly not the sort of joint initiatives that those two departments used in prior administrations. Certainly not the sort of show of combined force on college campuses that would send a signal. So I would say that there remain unused tools that are available that should be handled but aren't.
Let me, if I can, I'm gonna ask a question a different way, maybe a different way than Mr. Smucker and Mr. Hearn asked. In terms of higher education, you're formerly an administration official with the Department of Education. Do you have any recommendations on how we can increase the transparency of the foreign funding as it relates to higher education?
Congressman Kostov, if you were to increase the penalties for noncompliance, if you were to increase the enforcement over noncompliance, if you were to lower the threshold for disclosure requirements, in any of those instances, I think you would have much greater transparency.
Thank you. I thank you. I thank all the witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to the witnesses for being here. Your testimony is very helpful and I think comes at a critical moment. Congratulations to Ms. Dror. It's good to see you again. Congratulations on your graduation. It's particularly good to see my friend, our former colleague, Congressman Ted Deutsch, a fellow University of Michigan alum, I will note. Thanks for the great work you're doing. Look, I think it's clear anti-Semitism has no place in our communities and absolutely has no place on college campuses or universities. All across the nation, we are seeing acts of anti-Semitism on the rise. The Anti-Defamation League has reported large upticks in these threats, verbal and written harassment, and anti-Semitic acts. And let's be crystal clear, we are not talking about the right to protest. We're not talking about the right to disagree. We're not even talking about acts of civil disobedience as we know them to be important elements of public disagreement in this country. What we're talking about is hate speech that has a consequence, instills fear in people, leads to acts of violence. Just 2 weeks ago, as an example, I mentioned the University of Michigan. A good friend of mine, a regent, an elected regent at the University of Michigan, Jordan Acker, who happens to be Jewish, had his law office vandalized with anti-Semitic graffiti. Acts like this are completely unacceptable and can't become normalized. That's why hearings like this are important, to put it on the record, to make it clear that the right to disagree cannot be conflated with hate speech that has a consequence and degrades the quality of our society. So I am happy to see some action. I'm happy that the Biden administration are taking actions to address much of this. Ongoing engagement with Homeland Security, Department of Justice, state and local law enforcement, that's important. But speaking out on anti-Semitism is not and should never become a political or partisan issue. And there are some who will try to take this moment to weaponize it for political purposes. Like most Americans, we can't tolerate that. We all struggle to try to make sense of the acts that we've seen take place, starting with the horrific attack by Hamas on Israel on October 7th, the fact that hostages continue to be held, and for some, obviously myself included, the thousands and thousands of innocent lives that have been lost in the course of this war. As an elected official, as a citizen, as a father, as a human being, we have to mourn all of those losses, but we can't allow that pain to translate to more pain and more hate. So let me ask Congressman Deutsch, if you might, from your perspective, obviously we see anti-Semitism as a serious threat. Where in our society, I mean, we're talking a lot about campuses, but where are we seeing the largest rise in this sort of anti-Semitism? Where in our society?
Well, we're seeing, and this gets exactly to the comments you just made, Congressman Kildee, there is a refusal to understand, to acknowledge the facts that we're dealing with at this moment. The fact that there are 120 hostages still remaining. The fact that yes, we mourn the loss of every civilian life. As human beings, of course we do that. But there's a refusal to acknowledge that the reason that those lives are at risk is because Hamas will not return the hostages and lay down its arms. That Israel is defending itself after the worst terror attack, the worst attack against the Jewish community since the Holocaust. And where are you seeing this dramatic increase? You saw it on the streets of New York. You saw it in the streets of Washington just last weekend. You see it by those who are not protesting the policies of an Israeli government. They're celebrating the atrocities of a terror organization. They show up wearing Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad headbands. They talk about killing Zionists. 1,000 more, 10,000 more October 7th. That's where we're seeing this dangerous spike. It's why this hearing is so important. It's why universities need to be clear about what they're going to do to hold people accountable when the students come back in the fall. This is not a partisan issue, and I appreciate your saying that. And just finally, one other way to get at this, the other piece of legislation that was referenced earlier, the Combating Anti-Semitism Act, is a bipartisan bill. Equal number of Democrats and Republicans on it, co-sponsored by introduced by the co-chairs of the bipartisan task force to combat anti-Semitism, and would specifically address all of this anti-Semitism by having an ongoing effort in the White House and at the Department of Education. I really encourage, again, in the true spirit of bipartisanship, which is on such full display here, which is so gratifying for me in my new role running a fiercely nonpartisan organization, I would encourage members to take a look at that as well. And I thank very much, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Jason, you look different. Looks good in the chair.
The chair recognizes Representative Estes for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses for being here today. And Congressman Deutsch, thank you. Good seeing you again, coming back. You know, the anti-Semitic activities that have occurred on college campuses are absolutely appalling. Our institutions of higher education should be beacons of hope in this country, where students seek reason, truth, and an education to help them with their life and whether it's a career or personal life. Instead, we see disruption in unruly students, faculty, administration, and in some cases outside provocateurs siding with a terrorist organization and chanting death to Israel while forcing Jewish students to fear and hide, unable to fully benefit from the college education they are paying for. When you think about the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, it's really unfathomable that anyone in the country would stand up and carry the flag of terror and hate openly onto a college campus and face no repercussions. Unfortunately, this didn't happen overnight. While the horrendous attacks on October 7th may have brought this to the forefront, anti-Semitic activity has been a growing problem as foreign bad actors have been funneling money onto our nonprofit colleges and universities to shape and influence these institutions to promote a distorted worldview that is downright anti-American. Today, we're seeing the effects of the millions of foreign dollars from anti-Israel and anti-American countries and organizations that have pumped into our institutions, and it's a horrible consequence that we're reviewing now. Our tax code and its treatment of college endowments shouldn't help foster these kind of anti-Semitic activities that have ravaged college campuses across the country. Mr. Pawlowski, Ways and Means Republicans have sought to hold America's so-called elite universities accountable for permitting and promoting anti-Semitic behavior on their campuses while allowing Jewish students to be threatened, harassed, and assaulted. One mechanism in the committee's jurisdiction is the endowment tax, first established under the Trump tax cuts in 2017. Do you think that structure of the endowment tax should be revised in light of the anti-Semitic activity on certain college campuses?
Absolutely. The universities need new accountability structures because the existing structures have proven inadequate. If you just look at private universities with endowments above $100,000 per student, the value of those endowments is over $500 billion. If you look at the 12 largest private endowments, 11 of those schools are the schools that we've seen in the news. The only thing that will change the behavior of our so-called elite universities is financial penalties for tolerating this.
As you mentioned, both in your prepared remarks and in just the comments just now as well, that the current endowment tax, as is set up, affects private colleges and institutions that have an endowment value over $500,000, and it applies to roughly 35 schools that on any given year, and as you mentioned, 11 of the 12 top universities were very prevalent in having disruptions or protests and attacks. Do you think it's a coincidence that there's a relationship between the amount of money that they have and their tax status, and what's the connection and how can we address that?
I think the connection between the money and the grotesque anti-Semitism is that universities that are this wealthy can waste a lot, and administrators, they are used to giving into the radical DEI left, right? And as we've discussed in this hearing, the DEI that we're concerned about is the DEI that teaches students to make snap judgment based on identity characteristics. And the only way that they can account for the success of Jews in America and the state of Israel is to turn the state of Israel into the oppressor. And that makes, of course, the Hamas the virtuous victim, right? So I do think there's a relationship, right? The wealth allows for these institutions to waste money building up these DEI apparatuses.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a critical conversation that we need to continue to having and to kind of seek out the root of, you might call it a plague or a disease that's affecting so many of our college campuses and make sure that we address it, maintain their status as good institutions for higher learning for the students that go there and the money that's spent by the students, by their parents, by taxpayers in terms of supporting them. So I appreciate your time for this hearing, and with that, I'll yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Representative Tinney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to this really all-star panel and all that so many of you have done on this really horrific issue. There's so many places to go, and I'm not sure where to start, but I want to just say in nearby Cornell University, my dad is a graduate of Cornell Law School back in the 50s. It was certainly not like it is today. Went on to serve as a trial lawyer and a judge, one of the longest serving Supreme Court justices in New York. He would be absolutely horrified at what's happening at Cornell University. And I keep hearing, I see these protesters as we all do as members of Congress, and thank you also to former Congressman Deutsch for being here and being a leader on this issue as well. We're confronted with people at our doors, and we need to get the truth out. And I think the truth is what really these universities are about. Almost every one of these colleges has Veritas somewhere in their motto, including my own university, Colgate University in upstate New York. But my concern is, how do we get this truth out? And I think I'd like to ask Ms. Dror, and congratulations and thank you for being in the breach during this really difficult time on campuses. Tell us a little bit about what happened to you, what happened to you as a college student on a campus where we had a professor just days after this horrific attack. Professor Rickford actually described the acts of Hamas as exhilarating and inspiring to Cornell students. And I watched the GoPro video that we were all allowed to see as members of Congress that were on Hamas terrorists' heads and their videos. And it was about a 45-minute montage. I could get to about 20 minutes. I almost think I don't like bad movies or anything, but this was the worst thing I think I've ever seen in my entire life. It was horrible. And we have protesters and people coming to our office telling us that this is not true. And I want to just get your view as a college student and what you witnessed on the college campus. I immediately called right after October 7th for the dismissal of Mr. Bickford. I did get a response from the president, President Pollock at the time. They did put him on leave, but I'm sure he's still making money on paid leave. I know it's not his full salary, but and when I get done with you, I want to ask Mr. Podlisny about your discussion about the endowments and the money and the exemptions at these college campuses. So if you could tell us briefly just your experience and what is being done at Cornell to try to bring us back to the truth and to try to keep the honesty in our college campus.
Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, Professor Rickford will be teaching again next semester after his paid leave is over. But I think you alluded to something very important, and if you'll indulge me, I do want to tell a quick story. The foreign funding entering our universities are incredibly concerning. Cornell gets $1.8 billion, capital B billion dollars from Qatar, an adversary of the United States. In December, I was able to have a meeting with Cornell's CFO in which I asked him, Cornell gets $1.8 billion from Qatar. There must be strings attached because there is no such a thing as a free lunch. So what's the string attached to your money? He didn't give me a really direct answer. But then I asked him, Mr. Cowan, what should I be telling my community right now? The Jewish community on campus is hurting. It was a month after we had received the blatant death threats. I said, what should I tell my community? He said, you should tell your community that girl that testified in Congress, well, she's only one person. And we have 17,000 students. I wonder if he knew who he was talking to, because the girl he was referring to was me. And I wonder if he knew that 7 months later, I would say his name into the microphone and show that first question that Chairman Smith asked in his most recent letter to administrators of whether or not they believe anti-Semitism is actually present on their campus, they might say yes, but the answer is no. Because in that moment, he invalidated my suffering as a Jewish student and the suffering of 22% of his student population. There might be 1,700 or 17,000 students, but 22% of them are Jewish, and many of them are Zionists. And so the administration does not understand the issue that is plaguing their university. It is systemic moral rot, and they cannot understand that.
Well, thank you for that, and I think that Professor Rickford should be removed from teaching altogether. I mean, this is part of the problem, and then to Mr. Podlisny, we only have a few seconds left. I agree with you. I think tax-exempt status, federal money flowing in, the endowments getting taxed at such low rates, money, as they say in politics, money talks and BS walks. I think this is really the only way to go with these, and you can confirm that in the last few seconds we have if the chairwoman would indulge us.
Absolutely. I think we need to look for new accountability structures, as many of them as we can. And so looking at the endowment tax is one of those, tax-exempt status is one of those. But other ideas would be to start asking the question, does a university with a $54 billion endowment, does it really need to be eligible for Title IV funding, or can it fund its own students? Similarly, we need to look at moving some of that Title IV funding off of traditional 2- and 4-year campuses so that students who want to spend 15 weeks studying can also access their Pell Grant. We need to change the financial incentive for these corrupt institutions.
I agree 100%. These institutions with these endowments have become about wealth, power, influence, and politics. We know that, and I thank you so much to all of you. I'm sorry I couldn't ask every one of you a question, but thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Ms. Dror, especially for what you've suffered at Cornell. Let's hope we remedy the situation with Professor Bickford. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd remind members to try to keep their comments to 5 minutes or less. The chair now recognizes Representative Sanchez for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for providing this committee with another serious opportunity to acknowledge and confront the reality of rising hate in our nation. And I also want to specifically thank our witnesses for being here today and sharing your perspectives, particularly Ms. Dror for sharing your personal experiences. It troubles me that across the country we are seeing a rise in reported hate crimes. Anti-Semitism is just one of the ways that we see groups that are targeted, but there are many other forms of hatred as well, from anti-Asian sentiment to Islamophobia to anti-immigrant rhetoric. We are seeing this rise in very dangerous, in my opinion, speech that I think leads to violence. So I want to be very clear that we cannot allow hate to grow anywhere, but especially here in the United States, and especially at our nation's college campuses and universities. Universities have an obligation under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to provide all students a school environment that is free of discrimination. But incidences of anti-Semitism, as we heard today, across college campuses are still rising. Universities should be places of knowledge, tolerance, and mutual respect, and there's simply no place for hate on college campuses across the country. We are a multicultural society, and we should be encouraging acceptance and tolerance for every group that is a part of the fabric of the United States. We certainly have to prioritize student safety. Universities need to provide a supportive learning environment for all students. We know that more diverse and inclusive campuses and workplaces foster safer environments for learning and growth. To those that are here today and who have experienced anti-Semitism, you need to know that this committee stands with you, as does the Biden administration, which has focused on combating anti-Semitism in school since releasing a related national strategy last May. The DOJ and the Department of Homeland Security have worked to strengthen coordination with local and campus law enforcement to respond to increasing incidences of hate-driven intimidation and also violence. President Biden's Department of Education has also made very clear that anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism are all prohibited under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So I want to thank the administration for standing so strongly against hate in our schools and across college campuses, because no student should have a fear of attending classes or other on-campus obligations and opportunities. I want to begin by asking the panel about hate speech. I would like to know if any of you think that hate speech is sort of the precursor to violence or can lead to violence. Does anybody disagree with that statement?
I completely agree.
That hate speech, if repeated often enough or increasing in intensity, can lead to violence. Anybody disagree with that?
I think the antidote to the hate speech is more speech, other perspectives, calling it out for what it is.
But the question is, does anybody here believe that hate speech, if repeated often enough and increasing in intensity, does not lead to violence? Okay. Just want to make sure that we have unanimity, because we see rising hate speech in college campuses, and certain groups at certain times in this country have been targets of hate speech. And while it's easy to rush to the defense of your community when your community is under attack, when you hear hate speech that targets any group, we all have an obligation, I think, to stand up and, as you said, Doctor, to combat hate speech, to call it out for what it is, and to correct the record. So it's particularly disappointing when we see leaders, whether they be academics or public servants, using hate speech like the blood of our country is being poisoned by a particular group, or like one particular group of people in this country, they all have AIDS. That's hate speech. And if you repeat the lie often enough and increase in intensity, you are creating the perfect tinder for the catalyst of violence. So again, I just want you to know the committee stands against anti-Semitism. We live in a multicultural society, and we have to all defend each other when that happens. I am sorry for your experiences, and I am here to work with my colleagues to try to help combat that, to the degree that we can, and we will look for solutions given the recommendations that you have given us today. Thank you so much for being here, and I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative Miller for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Van Dyne and Ranking Member Schneider, and thank you all for being here today. I am horrified by these acts of anti-Semitism, and I can't really comprehend it. I grew up in the city of Columbus, Ohio, within the city of Bexley, in a very large Jewish population. I went to bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs growing up. There was a girl in my class whose mother had a tattoo on the inside of her arm. I cannot comprehend what is happening today. It's mind-blowing. Ms. Dorr, you know it's not easy to be here. You've already done this once. You're doing it again. It can be rather intimidating, but you seem like a very strong young woman, and I'm proud of you. And I commend you for the bravery of standing up for yourself. And of course, congratulations on your graduation. And I'm sorry that you really didn't have the experience of enjoying your senior year and hanging out and looking forward to graduation. Did you have any help from the university planning ahead of where you were going to go with your life in your senior year? Did you have any of that kind of support?
Thank you, Ms. Miller. It's great to see you again, and thank you for your warm wishes. I will say I just graduated and have had a pretty busy year trying to deal with the hatred on my campus. I have sent multiple emails to my university calling out the hate, asking for help, asking them to do something, and I've been met with generic email responses saying, please see the Office of Help and Care and Love and Hugs, and that absolutely will not do it for me. I've also turned to career services for help. And I remember particularly in one meeting, I was working on my resume with a staff member when she told me, by the way, I just want you to know, people might not hire you because of your political involvement. My political involvement is standing against Jews feeling afraid to walk on their campus. If people aren't hiring me, we have a much, much, much bigger problem. That's bigotry.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. And it could be a lot longer than that, honestly. Mr. Marcus, in spite of the instances of physical violence against Jewish students, universities pretty much have still held to inaction, and they're hiding behind free speech as the reasoning for their silence. Violence is not free speech. Violence is not free speech. And many colleges and universities have adopted a policy of what is now called institutional neutrality, which means that the institution won't take a public position on social or political issues unless it threatens the very mission of that school and its values. So, I don't know what to say. Since its creation, it's been adopted by a number of schools across the country. Tell me, what do you think of this policy of institutional neutrality?
Congresswoman Miller, when the principle of institutional neutrality first became popular, I thought it was a fine idea because too many institutions are taking the wrong sides of issues and impairing the environment on their campus by doing so. On the other hand, I noticed that there are many institutions that are now adopting that principle only when they've been asked to condemn terrorist attacks against the Jewish people. Then all of a sudden they say, oh, well, maybe we don't want to have to take a stand, and maybe if we adopt this principle, we will have some sort of cover, some sort of excuse for why we don't do it. And I would say that in those instances, it's not really about neutrality, it's about cowardice and should be called out as such.
You know, I grew up in the 60s, and I experienced protests and the rest. Violence is against the law. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing. It is deeply troubling that we are once again having a hearing to discuss the rise in anti-Semitism across our nation's college campuses. And since our hearing in November, we've seen repeated acts of violence, the development of illegal encampments, and a continued lack of accountability being upheld by so many quote-unquote elite institutions. The rhetoric and actions of students, largely in support of Hamas and in opposition to the ideals of democracy and freedom, have drawn the admiring attention and support of America's enemies. This includes Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Iran has long funded terror groups across the Middle East, including Hamas and including Hezbollah. And on May 29th, Khamenei tweeted, "Dear university students in the United States of America, you are standing on the right side of history." This example from the world's leader of state-sponsored terrorism underscores the threat we face, not only from our enemies seeking to take advantage, but even from within our own nation. I want to start with Professor Davidi. Can you speak to the shift you've seen within our universities to having so many outspoken students be comfortable with their alignment to an autocratic leader who is actively desiring the downfall of these very institutions that they are attending, that they're protesting at, and also wishing physical harm to Americans?
Thank you for this question. I'm really happy to talk about this. We're focused here on anti-Semitism and support for terrorism, but at the heart of it, you can see that this is about anti-Americanism. Just a few examples. Students for Justice in Palestine, the national organization, if you go on their website, it does not acknowledge the United States. It says that they have over 200 chapters across Turtle Island, and then in parentheses it says occupied North America, occupied United States and Canada. We had a professor, Hamid Abishi, described Israel, and I quote, as an outpost of American barbarism. This is a professor at Columbia. We had students celebrating the Houthis, right, the terrorist organization that executes gay men just for being gay, and who this morning shot down a merchant ship, a commercial merchant ship. So it really is an anti-American sentiment that is, like smarter people have said before me, it always starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. And I think the best way to see that is, where do you see American flags? When the pro-Israeli groups rally, you see Israeli flags and American flags. When you see an American flag in these pro-Hamas protests, it's only when it's being burned.
Thank you, sir. I want to quickly move now to discuss school accountability. It's been very troubling to see the reports of faculty groups forming in the mold of Students for Justice in Palestine. And in some instances, these faculty for justice and Palestine groups are taking part in anti-Semitic efforts of their student counterparts. For example, at the University of Pennsylvania, my own backyard, in Philadelphia, a chapter of FJP blocked the main entrance to an administrative building during a quote-unquote die-in protest, which was a violation of campus policy at that time. I want to ask both Mr. Marcus and Ms. Dror, based on your experiences in this space and familiarity with these campus groups, what actions do you believe school administrators should be taking to address specifically the faculty issue? And have you, Ms. Dror, in your experiences, have you seen instances at Cornell not actively enforcing their stated policies?
Absolutely. I can think of at least 3 different instances in which faculty canceled classes. So students paying for their tuition were denied the right to their education in the name of Palestinian liberation and supporting the encampment. The faculty also got together and published an article in Al Jazeera, Qatari state-funded media. Our faculty, I think today actually, published a large letter with about 250 signees that endorsed terrorism and endorsed all the protests on our campus. I think all faculty need to be terminated if they are promoting anti-American beliefs. Russell Rickford, the faculty member mentioned earlier, was hired after having written that he blames Israel for committing 9/11. So there need to be some serious reforms in the hiring processes of these faculties as well.
Thank you. My time's expired, so Mr. Marcus, if you could submit your answer for the record, that'd be great.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for having this hearing today and our witnesses for your sharing your insights, your patience. I know it's been a long day, but this is a critically important issue. As we've talked about throughout the day, since October 7th, the worst day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, a day when Hamas sent thousands of fighters across the border, terrorists across the border, barbarically murdered, tortured, raped, burned dead bodies, more than 1,200 killed, 250 taken hostage. Since that horrific day, we have seen a spike of anti-Semitism around the world, in the United States, but in particular, we're talking today about what we've seen on campuses. We've mentioned the spike. We've mentioned the fact, I think Mr. Deutsch mentioned that 80% of Jewish students on campus have a sense of identity, of connection, of personal closeness to the Jewish state. Not surprisingly, I think the other statistic besides that is that approximately 80% of Jewish students report fear or reluctance or decision not to wear or display outward signs of their Judaism, whether it's wearing a kippah or a Star of David. What I'd like to do, with the chairman's permission, is introduce into the record a document, the American Jewish Committee State of Anti-Semitism in America 2023 Insights and Analysis.
Without objection.
Thank you. We talked earlier in the opening remarks. The sense was part of the reason for this rise in anti-Semitism was weak university leadership, the failure of universities to enforce their policies, of university leaders to make clear, morally clear statements. We've talked about the radical faculty and other things. And throughout this, we've also touched, and I'll add my items to the list, but following the money. It's not just the money that's funding universities, it's the money that's funding these groups like Students for Justice in Palestine. Earlier when I was focusing on faculty, students, and Mr. Earl, I'll pick on you. You made it through in 4 years. Correct?
3.
3, even better.
Yeah.
But over the course of that, freshman students come in, they have to learn their way around, they pick their classes, they get involved with various organizations. Sophomore year, they start thinking about major, junior major, and graduate and go on to pursue their careers. But there is an imbalance as groups like SJP have people who are in their 13th year of their 4-year PhD program, not having completed a single class, but they're there with a purpose and with funding behind it. I think we need to look into that. But I also want to be careful that we don't paint with too broad of a brush. Dr. Lesney, you mentioned there are, I think, 70 schools where we had these protests, roughly 3,000 people who have been arrested, but there are 4,000 colleges and universities across this country. Not every university has gotten it wrong. Not every university has been affected by what we've seen on some of the campuses in the news. We have to be careful that we don't delegitimize differences of opinion, which is what we should see on our universities, the ability to have that debate with each other with the focus on hate and violence. Hate begets violence. Violence makes our students feel unsafe, and ultimately there will be consequences. Mr. Deutsch, I want to turn to you with the minute that's left, but you've been here in Congress, you're at an American Jewish Committee seeing the challenges being faced across the country. Can you highlight the most important things we should be doing besides talking about it and putting a spotlight on the hate and violence we're seeing on campus? What actions should we be taking that will have a real difference as we head to the new academic year?
Thank you. Look, I think the conversation about tax exempt status is important. I think the conversation about foreign funding is important. I would add to that, by the way, Why not have every student group have to certify that they don't accept foreign funding as well? There are lots of things that are part of this bigger issue that we have to deal with. But right now, there is a train that is barreling down the tracks. Literally, you saw it in New York in a subway car. When people are allowed to get on a subway car and say, where are the Zionists? Are there Zionists here? No Zionists here. This is your chance to get out. That should send a chill down everyone's spine. What Congress can do most, and here's what I've learned since I left. Here's my message to my former colleagues. I say this with enormous respect, and not to just make you feel even better about the job you have. You have enormous power individually, every one of you. And what can you do? Every one of you, yes, the committee should act. And Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to you and to the Speaker for this whole of the House approach. But every one of you can play a role in your community, listening to your Jewish students, listening to the Jewish community. If you don't have a large Jewish community, you can speak out in support of the American values that are at risk when we see what's happening around the country continue to take place. That's what you can do. Expect the universities to take action now in advance of this coming academic year to help protect Jewish students, protect their environment that they operate in, our university system overall, and ultimately our democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for one more second. The video from that train car was horrific, as they said, any Zionist here, any Zionist here. Any Jewish person in that car would have been afraid to stand up. But
not me.
Let me finish.
I would have stood up.
Let me finish, please. But no one else stood up either. It was utter silence, and those people were able to say what they say. We have to speak out, and that's why this hearing is important. We need to stand up. We need to speak out and say, I say proudly as a Jew, but I say as an American, hate has no place in our country. We will stand up and make sure it is defeated. I yield back.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I absolutely agree. We have to be the ones that speak out. It's tragic that we have to have this hearing. It's absolutely tragic. It is 2024, and this should not be happening, and it is appalling. And so you can see as I was listening to Mr. Schneider, I'm getting more and more upset, but I did want to kind of refocus. I know that Mr. Fitzpatrick talked a little bit about FJP and SJP has been mentioned a couple of times. And so I wanted to ask Mr. Marcus, you're obviously familiar with the group. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about the group and maybe the role that it's been playing in this explosion of anti-Semitism on campuses?
Congresswoman Fishbach, yes. There is no one single group that's responsible for this entire problem. There are many groups involved, and then there are many wrongdoers who are not part of groups, but SJP is involved far more than any other single individual on many, many campuses, not just in protest, but in various forms of hate as well. On some campuses, their violation of rules or undermining of values has led to their temporary or permanent suspension or expulsion, but they are still active on a large number of universities. They're also active as law students for Justice in Palestine, and now they're also faculty for Justice in Palestine as well. These groups, in addition to having been found responsible for violations of university rules and for their involvement in issues that may create a hostile environment for Jewish students, the toolbook for the national SJP says, among other things, and I'll quote, "We as Palestinian students in exile are part of this movement," meaning the resistance movement, "not merely in solidarity with this movement. We must act as part of this movement." Now, the resistance movement is often understood to include Hamas, known also as the Islamic Resistance Movement. So when an organization of students who says that they are not merely in solidarity, but that they are part of this movement, it raises the question of how they, as an organization, are relating to a U.S. State Department designated terrorist organization and doing it actively on campuses around the United States.
Thank you very much. And Professor, maybe you want to add, and Ms. Dora, I'm going to ask you too, if the response and the evidence we've seen, how did the universities respond to, did they take sufficient or proper response to those organizations?
I can speak about a lot of universities, but the best one that I can is my own, Columbia. Nothing. They have written beautiful emails. It took the president of the university 6 months minus 2 days to acknowledge that Hamas exists. So I have been asking, I've been pleading for them to condemn Hamas. They wouldn't even use the word Hamas in any official email until April 5th, and that was because she was subpoenaed to testify in front of Congress. So if it takes the president of a quote-unquote elite, not elite, but expensive university, to even acknowledge that Hamas is responsible for this, then I'm not surprised, and you shouldn't be surprised, that she and her administration have done absolutely nothing.
Thank you.
I think something worth noting is the double standard. All other groups are subject to policy enforcement, and Students for Justice in Palestine and hate groups on my campus are not. Fraternity Brothers most recently received firm disciplinary action for drinking beer in a backyard with a permit. The Students for Justice in Palestine group had an unauthorized encampment, ruined our entire quad, the entire lawn needed to be redone, and did not receive any actual enforcement on that. In fact, they received complete immunity and a thank you letter from our university.
Well, and I just want to say thank you all for being here, and thank you for standing up, because you're doing something courageous by being here too. And I appreciate it, and I, for one, I will say, I will stand with you, because this is, it's appalling that we are dealing with this in 2024, and I thank you for being here, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you
very much.
I want to submit to the record, actually, an article that was just brought to my attention at Columbia University. The title is Columbia Administrators Fire Off Hostile and Dismissive Text Messages, Vomit Emojis during Alumni Reunion Panel on Jewish Life. The administrators that's listed in this include the Dean of Columbia College, the Vice Dean and Chief Administrator Officer of Columbia College, the Dean of Undergraduate Student Life, and the Associate Dean for Student and Family Support. Without objection, I submit it to the record.
Mr. Chair, may I comment on that article for 1 second?
Yes, please.
One thing to note in that article is not just their ridiculing of everything that's going on, but the fact that as a panel of Jewish individuals were speaking about the problems of anti-Semitism, these administrators use an anti-Semitic trope saying that this Jewish person is using this moment for fundraising. So it's not just cowardness, it's callousness.
It's terrible. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. Much of what I have prepared and want to say has largely been said, so there will be some repetition in what I communicate in my few minutes here. But I'm gonna pose one question, and to all of you, and to the extent we have time, we're open to hear from any of you about, like, what can we do to change this trajectory right now? I've talked to folks, particularly someone that went to a university that would have been tied up into this, into what I view as just complete lawlessness and nonsense that went onto our campuses. And she was telling me the story about, like, we actually had a case study. We talked about this region. We understood the plight of both the Jewish state as well as the Palestinian state and the Palestinians. And I've actually been to Ramallah. I met with folks that run the banking system there, and individual and Palestinians, and the difficulties they have for what their future looks like. I mean, and she's like, we went through a case study. It was one of the most enlightening things that I experienced. That's what our college campuses should be doing. What we saw recently with these encampments and the lawlessness that takes place is the exact opposite of what we need to experience on our college campus. So my question to you all is, what can we do to actually, change the trajectory of the way our universities are going when difficult things come up? There has been probably very, very few things that have been as emotional for me in my time in Congress than to be, and I'm not nowhere near close to it, But seeing what took place on October 7th is probably one of the most emotional things that's happened to me. There's a father of 4. He jumped on a grenade to save his boys. I have 4 boys about that same age. I didn't know something that could happen so far away, even though I've been to those kibbutzes where it took place. And then to know this was ultimately the plan. This is Iran's plan all along. They want the public sentiment to change on Israel. And they want what's going on to actually have happen. I wish students could understand the big picture and how do we get back to being able to communicate it. I'll mention one thing, and especially now that my colleague, Mr. Schneider's here. I've never been, as emotional as that was, I've been more proud of any work that we've done, that in the aftermath of that, Mr. Schneider and my colleague, Mr. Panetta, and I have led numerous efforts to make sure that we support and find ways for the conflict that's going to be going on in Gaza to find ways out and to help the humanitarian effort. Hosting the State Department, the 3 of us have done yeoman's work on figuring this out. And so we're all trying to deal with it. It's a difficult situation. It's tragic. Let me pose that question. Mr. Marcus, I would love to start with you. Just like, what can we do? Do university presidents have to really crack down, or what can we be doing to improve the way we communicate our dialogue and be able to get our dialogue out there so people actually learn instead of just chaos?
Congressman Moore, over this summer, the best of our college administrators are working around the clock to tighten up their policies on conduct, protest, and the like, while the worst of our administrators are ignoring this and allowing things to worsen. Frankly, they will all likely fail if they only look at policies and don't look more deeply at what is leading to this cultural problem. Why is it that universities that should be a source of light and tolerance have become the opposite? That is systemic, and it goes beyond policies and to how they build their faculty, their curriculum, their student body, etc.
Doctor, I'd welcome you.
So on this particular issue, I think we have to acknowledge that there's been a concerted effort to change the way Israel is taught about and how the region is taught about going back to the 1970s. The reason for those gifts was to change the way elite universities teach about the region. The New York Times, if you read the New York Times from the 1970s and the 1980s, there are a lot of stories about alarm about the money coming in. And so I think the money needs to be shut off, and I think we need to bring viewpoint diversity to our public affairs disciplines.
Professor.
5 things that I think every university should do. 1, permanently ban every pro-terror student organization. Suspensions are a slap on the wrist that it does nothing. 2, expel the leaders. They know who the leaders of these organizations are. Most of the students protesting are good people, but the leaders need to be held accountable. 3, every one of these organizations has a faculty advisor. Those faculty advisors should be sanctioned and maybe fired. 4, every faculty that supports terrorism, that openly celebrates Hamas, Islamic Jihad, should not be allowed to interact with undergraduates, graduates, any student. They can still have their job, but they are not allowed to be with any students. And 5, every university should adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. If it's good enough for the US Congress, if it's good enough for the President of the United States, it should be good enough for the President of Colombia.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses, and of course, Mr. Deutsch. It's always good to see you. As I told you prior to your leaving, you are one of those members that we miss. So thank you for being here today in this capacity especially. I think we can all agree that all students deserve a safe place to learn, free from hate, speech, and discrimination. And I think we understand that free speech and protests, though, are part of university life. However, when protests turn violent, demonstrators break the law, or debates devolve into hate speech, actions need to be taken. What I think is an issue, though, is that when it comes to policies to govern protests and speech on campuses, there are just different standards and difficult standards to meet. When it comes to the First Amendment, there are different policies for public universities which are bound by the First Amendment and private universities which are not. 2, also, we know that to receive federal funds, colleges must adhere to the Civil Rights Act, but that bar to prove discrimination in court is very high. And another issue is that universities have enforced their rules unevenly, as many of you have discussed today. We've seen college administrators curtail speech in certain areas to accommodate students, even for some microaggressions, yet the same administrators appear unmoved by the distress of Jewish students. And sure, all colleges have limits on time, place, and manner of protest so students can attend class, but they are implemented differently. We know that there are examples of universities getting this right by addressing anti-Semitic actions while shutting down protests that endanger the campus community. I saw that in my district at a local university, and it was even written about by a student who wanted to get to class and appreciated the university's actions to clear the protest. Now, unfortunately, though, some of these positive examples are overshadowed by the missteps of others. When university administrators have taken action against demonstrations, they've been accused for going too far as well. Moreover, heavy-handed policing can galvanize protesters and prove counterproductive. Despite that, though, we should ensure that the positive examples are followed and that we have mechanisms in place to support Jewish students and address and prevent anti-Semitic incidents on campus. Look, we can agree that colleges should protect the rights of students to raise their hands in class in which they can make claims about the Jewish state or even express misguided support for a terrorist organization, because the airing of bad ideas is an important part, not just of college life, but of American life. But letting protesters yell intifada and intimidating Jewish students trying to get to class is not consistent with free speech. Nor is there a free speech right to occupy parts of a university. And yes, we support freedom of assembly as part of the First Amendment, but that does not mean that protesters have a right to assemble anywhere if it means that it prevents other people from using public spaces. And of course, damaging property and defacing statutes is a crime whether you are on campus or in a public park. So if there are lawbreakers that are practicing civil disobedience, they need to do it in a way, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, do it openly, do it lovingly, but doing with the willingness to accept the penalty. Now look, all of you have expressed disappointment in your testimony about the responses from colleges on this issue. We can condemn anti-Semitic speech from students. However, it is ultimately the university leaders to protect students on campus. Now, Mr. Deutsch, you talked with my colleagues' questions about what Congress can do. What should universities be doing to address some of these issues that I talked about so that we can prepare for the coming school year to ensure that basically, yes, we protect free speech, but we also crack down on hate speech?
Well, first of all, it's good to see you, Congressman, and thank you for your very thoughtful comments. It starts with acknowledging that universities have the primary responsibility here, that as they're looking ahead to the fall, they're taking action like we've seen at other universities, where, number one, they're speaking out with moral clarity about what is and isn't acceptable, about, as Professor Davidai points out, there can be no tolerance for the support of terrorism on campus. This has been a really interesting conversation. In real life on college campuses, there are students who are actively speaking out in support of the terrorists who committed the 10/7 atrocity. They should be speaking with more clarity. They should be making sure that the code of student conduct on their campus has been updated to reflect the moment. It should be clear what the repercussions are if it's violated. They should make every student acknowledge what those repercussions are. We've heard this earlier, so that it's clear what will happen, and then they need to actually follow through if the code of student conduct is violated. Those are all important steps that they should be putting in place right now before a single student comes back to campus, to set a tone for what is and isn't acceptable, to create the kind of university community that every university president claims that they want.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Van Dyne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I request an unanimous consent to insert for the record a campus-wide email that Cornell President Martha Pollack sent on May 14th, 2024.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'd like to read a short excerpt from it. Dear Cornellians, last evening the Coalition for Mutual Liberation voluntarily took down their encampment on the Arts Quad. While I do not condone the encampment, which was in clear violation of university policies, I want to acknowledge and express gratitude that, in contrast to what has taken place at some other universities, the participants here remained peaceful and nonviolent throughout, and for the most part, they tried to minimize the disruption caused. With this in mind, and provided no further violations of university policy occur, we are able to pause on issuing additional suspensions and disciplinary referrals. The participants in the encampment shared that members of our Jewish community who have criticized Israel have been targeted with slurs, which not only is deeply offensive, but also trivializes the memory of the Holocaust. Other students involved in the encampment shared experiences of being called terrorists over the past few months in an expression of anti-Arab discrimination and hatred. No matter one's political beliefs, using such rhetoric which questions the basis of someone's religious, cultural, ancestral, or any form of identity is unacceptable. And I implore everyone in our community to think carefully about their words." End quote. It's disappointing that after the chaos and the distress that were caused by mobs of students who set up illegal encampments that raged with anti-Semitism across the country, and Ms. Dorr, you described this as anything but peaceful and non-disruptive. But it's disappointing that one of President Martha Pollock's last acts as the president of Cornell University is to express concern that a single student in the encampment says that they were called a slur after Jewish students on Cornell's campus feared for their lives after numerous death threats and harassment that raged for months without end. Ms. Dorr, I want to thank you again for taking the time to testify before this committee. Can you please share with us how you felt when you received this email, and how did you feel when you read that the president of your university said that the encampment participants here remain peaceful and nonviolent?
Congresswoman, it's great to see you, and I really appreciate this question because this email was actually the moment I decided not to attend my graduation. This is laughable. I've spent the past 8 months being called a Nazi because I believe in the existence of the state of Israel. And for her to protect students, falsely mischaracterizing Israel defending itself as a genocide in the name of trivializing the Holocaust is laughable and shameful. I also want to bring up a point that you mentioned in that email. She said, a Jewish student that criticized Israel. No, these students call for the complete elimination of the Jewish state and every single Jew inside of it. They are calling for a Jewish genocide. Also, she mentioned that these students have been referred to on campus as terrorists. These students are openly supporting the PFLP, Hamas, and Hezbollah. They are also regularly terrorizing Jewish students on campus by threatening them and intimidating them. It's no surprise that Martha Pollock protects the students behind the encampment when $1.8 billion are funneled into Cornell by United States adversaries.
I appreciate your comments. We've had a lot of discussion now about some of the lack of actions that were taken against not just the students, but other faculty. And you mentioned specifically Russell Rickford. I understand that he was on paid leave. I also understand that he's coming back to campus to teach next semester. Your comments on how to handle that is quite clear. And I think as a committee, looking at universities and whether or not they are teaching anti-American hate, whether they are teaching things that are specifically aimed at creating distrust, division, violent outbursts that are being promoted by their own professors, their own administration, I think that's something that we have to take seriously, whether or not that's on campus or off campus. If they are putting out stories, if they are putting out articles, yes, while that may not have been written on campus, it does say a lot and it does reflect a lot on the university. And whether or not these universities are actually upholding a pro-America position, and yet they're getting taxpayer-funded dollars, and they're also getting tax-exempt status. And I know that this is something that the chairman takes seriously, has spent a lot of time looking into, and that as a committee we're going to continue to look into. So again, thank you very much, and I yield back my time.
Thank you.
Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to congratulate you, Ms. Dror, on graduating. I had 3 kids that graduated this year. So it's awesome. It's awesome. And I wish you the best as you move forward in your life. I was on faculty at Dordt University, one of my local universities near my hometown. And being on faculty meant that I was responsible for the students there, that I was responsible for their safety, I was responsible for what they learned, and we could debate, we could argue, but at the end of the day, it was, we do it in a safe environment. And that's what's so disappointing about this, is that we have a failure by tax-exempt universities to provide and enforce discipline on students that are found to violate the basic rules of their institution. So as a committee on Ways and Means, we must look at our responsibility. Right? We can always talk about the universities. I get it. Universities have a tremendous amount of responsibility. Their board of trustees got to do things. We just talked all about that. But we have the obligation to decide whether an organization is tax exempt or not. Bottom line, that's our job. And you start looking at Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, okay? Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, if a complaint is investigated, and we can talk about this shortly, Mr. Marcus, because I want to know about this, but if a violation is made, to me, there's got to be a solution that it never happens again. And the solution to me is losing your tax-exempt status. I mean, frankly, this happens in business. In business, if you violate a certain status, or if you're tax exempt, if you're a nonprofit, all right, you get your tax exempt pulled away. That's the same thing that should happen here. So I want to ask each one of you, Ms. Dror, what do you think about this? I mean, do you think the federal government should act in this purpose? Because to me, if you pull away their tax exempt status, things change very quickly. Trust me, they will change. What do you think about that?
Absolutely, and as I mentioned before, Chairman Smith's investigation into these universities have finally gotten them to act. That is the only thing that is pushing them to act.
Yes, yes. Professor, what do you think?
I completely agree with your assessment. The only thing that I would say is there is no difference between college campuses and the House Committee, because they are training your future colleagues. So if you don't act now, your future colleagues will not let you act when they get to Congress.
Well said. 100% agree. Doctor?
So the Department of Education should issue findings that these universities are not doing anything to ensure that Jewish students have access to the education that Title VI guarantees them. And at that point, if it should make real demands, right? It should say, audit your foreign gifts, audit your academic programs for anti-Israel bias, enforce your policies, take a hard look at how you're socializing international students to the norms and expectations of the campus. And if the universities do not comply with those expectations, then it's time to begin an administrative proceeding to end their access to Title IV aid. I also think it's time to start talking very seriously about raising endowment taxes and about ending the tax-exempt status.
And you sit on the OCR, you have.
Yes.
So I'd love to hear what you have to say on this.
So, Congressman Fenstre, it is rare that a university is adjudicated liable for violation.
And why is that?
It's difficult and expensive to get to that point. It's also rare that OCR has formal findings of a violation against a university. If universities knew that a formal finding or adjudication under Title VI could jeopardize their tax funds, you would see them respond much more forcefully to credible allegations.
Yes, thank you. Finally,
Thank you, Congressman. Look, I want to just use this as an opportunity to thank you and urge the committee to keep at this in a bipartisan way. This is not a partisan issue. No. We should be looking at every possible way to get universities to ensure that they're living up to their own ideals. And if this is a way to start that conversation and get them there, then we ought to be having that conversation.
You know what? When you affect the pocketbook, it makes a difference. Then people respond. And it's a tragedy that's what it takes, but it is. And these Board of Trustees, the only way they're going to learn is you take away their tax-exempt status. And it starts with Title VI in the Civil Rights Act. And it starts with using the Office of Civil Rights to start finding these schools and what they're doing and go after them. So thank you for each one of you for being witnesses. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you all for hanging in for more than 3 hours for this as we come and go. I'm very concerned about it. I think all of us here in a bipartisan way are concerned about it. I was disappointed that not a single Republican joined Senator Congressman Castan's appropriations letter to ensure that the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights had the funding it needed to pursue actual anti-Semitic crimes on college campuses. You know, we've been working on this in Congress for a long time. The current rise in hate crimes, deeply disappointing. According to the most recent hate crime statistics to data from the FBI, race-based crimes reached the highest level ever recorded in 21 and 22. But anti-Semitic hate crimes rose a whopping 36% from 2021 to 2022. But one of the key things we know about hate crimes is that they are also dramatically, drastically underreported. So that we know that even from this limited data, we're not getting the full picture. Mr. Olson, Mr. Upton, Mr. Buchanan, all three Republicans, and I partnered with Judy Chu to successfully pass the Jabir Hire No Hate Act. And that was to better support law enforcement to report and respond to hate crimes and set up state hate crime hotlines so that people who didn't feel comfortable going to the police station called them in. And while that bill is meaningful, we were very proud of it. It signed into law, and yet the reporting of the incidents has gotten worse. It's not improved at all. And at a time when reporting has gotten worse, FBI Director Wray was here in the fall to tell us that crimes towards Jews are reaching historic levels. I introduced a bill recently with Don Bacon, a Republican from Nebraska, the Improving Reporting to Prevent Hate Act. And I would love to have all my Republicans join me on this. It set up a process where DOJ evaluates jurisdictions with over 100,000 citizens to make certain that they are credibly reporting hate crimes. The goal is to ensure that we have a better handle on where these anti-Semitic incidents are occurring, how we can better track and address and prevent them. And Honorable Mr. Deutsch, welcome back. Can you speak about how a bill like this would be an asset in addressing the anti-Semitic crimes?
There's, as we've talked about over the course of this hearing, it's important for us to be able to really tackle anti-Semitism, for us to follow through and hold people accountable and hold universities accountable. We need more funding for the Office of Civil Rights so that they can do it. Likewise, the reason that the Jabir Hire No Hate Act was so important, and I applaud your leadership on that, Mr. Byer, is because we want to be able to be sure that we're identifying the hate crimes, particularly as we see this spike in anti-Semitism, and especially when we know that anti-Semitic hate crimes are often underreported. And the way to do that is to ensure that there is adequate funding to help get us there. So I applaud your efforts continuing to focus on that. I think it's an important way for us to move forward.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Chair, this late hour, I yield back.
In Missouri, this is still very early. Ms. Maliatakis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all believe it's unfortunate that we need to be here, and nobody thought in 2024 we would be dealing with this immense spike in anti-Semitism in our country, but it is so critical that we are here together as Republicans and Democrats trying to find the best solutions to stop this. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here. Certainly, Ms. Talia Dror, thank you. You're a student in New York State. I represent New York State, so I want to thank you for being here, not only once, but twice, because that takes tremendous amount of courage for you to come here. And I congratulate you on your graduation, and I'm sorry that you had to miss the ceremony. Since the horrific attacks on October 7th of last year by Hamas on Israel, the ugly face of anti-Semitism has showed on college campuses across the country. Instead of preparing our young people for life and getting them ready to be productive members of a civilized society, campuses have turned into indoctrination centers of hate. It seems to be getting worse to me. Maybe it's because I'm in New York City. And in the news, sadly, we've seen anti-Semites boldly flying the flags of Hamas, of Hezbollah, terrorist organizations. In my city, we've also seen a terrible display of a sign saying "Long Live October 7th" at a memorial that was dedicated to the victims of the Nova Music Festival. We've seen vandalism of homes of the Jewish board members of the Brooklyn Museum. And we've also seen, as you mentioned, Mr. Deutsch, the bullying of Zionists or pro-Israel individuals on the subway system, completely unacceptable. It starts with education, starts with the classroom. I think we need to work together. But I have introduced two bills I just want to mention briefly. I have HR 7231, which is the Campus Act, and this legislation would prohibit universities that have been found to promote anti-Semitic activities or allow them, or that are protecting anti-Semitic faculty from receiving federal funding. I think it's a good bill. I think it's something that would really maybe make a difference in pushing these university presidents to hold faculty or these student organizations accountable. Professor, I know you're also from New York City. I would love to hear your view if you support a measure like that and if you think it would be effective.
Well, to be honest, being a professor, I cannot comment on something I don't know all the details of. But as a fellow New Yorker, we have to remember anti-Jewish crime is the #1 hate crime in New York City for the past 7 years in a row. This is a spike, but this is not new. And this has been under the current Mayor Eric Adams administration, and it has been under the previous administrations. The biggest Jewish population of the US is in New York City, and nothing has been done.
It's getting worse. It's getting worse.
Unfortunately, hopefully this will stop it, but yeah.
Doctor, I would like to ask you, I have another bill, HR 7232, No Visas for Anti-Semitic Students Act, that would revoke the visa of foreign students in the United States who are members of these organizations and participating in this activity. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, our view is that there are 4 grounds of inadmissibility that have been triggered in some cases. Right? So DHS already has this authority to look at these protests and try to understand which of the students have espoused support or given support for terrorism, which of the students have committed crimes involving moral turpitude, any who lied in their visa application. And so I applaud your leadership from Congress, but I think the administration could take these actions itself if it wanted to.
Okay, well, perhaps this legislation would give them a little more teeth to do it. And Ms. Dror, would you agree with something like that? You think that we should be stripping visas from, whether it's my bill or whether it's the administration doing it, should we be stripping visas from foreign students who are committing anti-Semitic activity on our campuses?
Absolutely. The leader of the Coalition for Mutual Liberation, Cornell's program, or Cornell's organization, is on a student visa. He should get that student visa revoked yesterday.
It's a perfect example, Doctor. It's obviously not happening at the administration level. Hopefully we can push them with new legislation. Mr. Deutsch, you're obviously a subject matter expert on these issues as a member of Congress formerly. We'd love to talk to you about education. What can we do more to educate young people about the Holocaust, about the history of Israel? We have a Jewish student here who was called a Nazi by a fellow student. It's outrageous, simply because she supports Israel. Social media misinformation. These students that are doing this, they're actually proud to have the endorsement of Hamas and Iran. What can we do to educate young people, both at the state level and the national level?
I can answer that in 10 seconds. It's good to see you again, Congresswoman. Look, you touched on each of the key pieces. One, on social media, it is absolutely true that the majority of young people now get their news in 10-second, 6-second videos on TikTok and on Instagram. We have to make sure that the social media companies, that these platforms uphold their own rules, and then Congress is taking a hard look at that as well to make sure that they are, and other steps that can be taken. In the K-12 space, we've got to be sure that as we see the explosion in some parts of the country of curricula that not only don't accurately teach history, but specifically try to exclude Jews and the teaching of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, that we go the other way, that we make sure it's not just the Holocaust that we're studying, but the contributions of Jewish Americans to our country, that Jewish American Heritage Month is actually observed around the country in our businesses and in our local governments and every place where we have an opportunity to help educate people. That's another way. And on college campuses, we have an obligation to make sure that everyone on a college campus, including the residential advisors, including the members of the administration, not just the administration and his or her team, but everyone in the university has a chance to learn, again, yes, about the Holocaust, but also about the history of anti-Semitism, the history of the Jewish people. And frankly, it's important for everyone to understand the history of Israel so that these outrageous claims about Israel being a white settler colonialist enterprise, instead they'll actually learn that Israel is the homeland for the Jewish people with 3,000 years of history of Jews being connected to that land, that the state of Israel not only is not a white settler colonialist enterprise, but that the majority of Israelis are actually people of color. There's an enormous amount of education that's required. AJC, other groups play a role there. Our educators play a key role there. And I applaud you for raising it. It is the most important thing that we can do long-term to make sure that people understand the facts and so we can all push back against the kind of anti-Jewish hatred that we've seen.
May I just add that the majority of U.S. states do not require schools to teach about the Holocaust. Only 20 states have rules that you must teach about the Holocaust. 3 more have recommendations, and the rest nothing. So when, as a professor, at the point when I get my students to come to class, many of them, maybe a majority of them, have never taken a class about the Holocaust. So they go to TikTok.
Thank you for your insight and ideas.
Thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you all for taking the 4 hours to be in this hearing and for your words. You can count on us not stopping and rooting out this evil problem. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record today. With that, the committee stands adjourned.